There is a house sitting empty in a dead dimension, and when Rick Sanchez finally walks back into it, the place greets him in his wife's voice. It is a recording, a voice he built to sound exactly like hers, and it still plays, soft and warm, into a room where nothing is alive anymore. That is close to the very bottom of tonight's iceberg, and almost nobody who makes one of these starts down there. Tonight we are going all the way, from the burps and the catchphrases everyone already knows, down through the Citadel and the Cronenbergs and the interdimensional cable, and all the way to a weapon that erased one woman from every reality at once. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your eyes close whenever they want to, and if you have not subscribed yet, it honestly helps this little channel keep making these. This is Paper Town. Let us start at the top where the water is bright and everybody can see the bottom, because the surface of Rick and Morty is so familiar by now that it is easy to forget how strange the premise actually is. The whole thing runs on a simple engine. An old man, a scientist, the self-described smartest being in the universe, drags his 14-year-old grandson through holes he tears in the fabric of reality with a little green gun. That grandson is nervous, decent, in over his head every single time, and the old man is brilliant and reckless and drunk and, underneath all of it, wounded in a way the early episodes only hint at. That is the machine. Everything else, all the aliens and the arcades and the councils and the clones, hangs off that one relationship, and the series has spent more than a decade slowly revealing that the relationship is far darker than the goofy first impression lets on. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim on the 2nd of December, 2013, and the thing people get wrong about that first season, constantly, is the episode count. It is not 10 episodes, it is 11. That small correction matters more than it sounds, because that first run is where nearly every seed of the deeper story gets planted. Inside episodes that look at first like disposable science fiction comedy. You can watch that opening year as pure absurd fun, and most people did, and only later realize you were being shown the architecture of something enormous. Near the surface, before any of the lore, sits the portal gun, and it is worth understanding exactly what it does, and more importantly, what it does not do. The gun does not travel through time. Rick is adamant about this, again and again, almost irritably. This is not Back to the Future, even though it was born from a parody of Back to the Future, which we will get to much further down. The gun moves you sideways between parallel universes across an infinity of realities that already exist. Time travel here is treated as a lazy joke Rick refuses to do. There is a literal box in the garage labeled for time travel that he keeps putting off. The distinction sounds like a technicality, but it is the single most load-bearing rule in the entire series. Because if there are infinite universes, then there are infinite versions of everyone. And if there are infinite versions of everyone, then no single person is irreplaceable. And if no single person is irreplaceable, then what exactly is the point of loving any of them? That question is the whole show. It hides right there in the premise, on the surface, in the very first minutes. And we just accept it and laugh at the burps. Speaking of the burps, that is about as surface as it gets, and yet there is a real production fact underneath it that most casual viewers never learn. For most of the run, Rick's belching was not a sound effect dropped in later by an editor. Justin Roiland, who voiced the character for years, was often actually drinking on the microphone, beer or water, producing those burps live in the middle of his lines, improvising around them. Dan Harmon, the co-creator, has talked openly about encouraging Roiland to record while a little drunk because it loosened the performance and made Rick sound unpredictable and slurred and alive. The rawness you hear in early Rick is not entirely acting. Some of it is a man in a booth with a drink, riffing, and that texture became part of the character's DNA. Then there is the catchphrase, and this is where the surface first cracks a little because the most famous thing Rick ever says turns out to mean the opposite of how it sounds. Wooba, lubba, dub dub. In the first season, it reads as pure nonsense, a silly rallying cry the merchandise machine could print on a t-shirt, and it was printed on a great many t-shirts. But in the first season finale, an episode called Ricksy Business, Rick's old friend Birdperson explains that in his language, the phrase means, "I am in great pain, please help me." Suddenly, every time Rick shouted it, grinning, throwing his arms up like a mascot, he was actually broadcasting a distress signal that nobody around him could hear or chose to hear. This is the thing that hooks me about the whole surface layer. It hands you a joke and lets you enjoy the joke for a full season before revealing the joke was a cry for help the entire time. That single reveal is the show's whole method in miniature. Let us name the 2 moments that dragged Rick and Morty out of cult status and into the actual center of pop culture, because they both live near the surface and both spilled out into the real world in ways nobody planned. The first is Pickle Rick. In the 3rd season, in an episode simply called Pickle Rick, Rick turns himself into a pickle to get out of attending a family therapy session, an escape plan that is somehow both a stroke of mad genius and the most pathetic thing a person could possibly do to avoid talking about their feelings. Marooned as a pickle, unable to move, he survives by killing a cockroach, then a rat, and building himself a working body out of rat and roach parts through sheer force of intellect, sinews and all, before machine gunning his way out of a secret facility. It is a stunning piece of animation, and it became, overnight, the biggest meme the series ever produced. It also won the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, its first Emmy, in 2018. But the reason Pickle Rick lands, the reason it is more than a spectacle, is the scene bolted onto the end of it, back in the therapist's office. Dr. Wong, the family therapist, having heard the whole absurd story, tells Rick something quiet and devastating. She points out that he would rather turn himself into a pickle, rather do literally anything than attend a therapy session, because the difference between him and everyone else is that they are willing to do the work of maintaining a life, the boring, unglamorous, repetitive work, and he simply is not. And he covers that refusal with brilliance. She is not impressed by the pickle. She has his number. And at the height of its meme moment, Rick and Morty chooses to let a therapist calmly diagnose its own hero as a man running from his own life. That is the tension that keeps this series honest. The second moment that broke into the wider world is stranger, because it started as a throwaway gag and ended with police outside fast food restaurants. In the 3rd season premiere, Rick reveals, or claims to reveal, his one true driving motivation in life, and it is not revenge, and it is not family. It is McDonald's Szechuan sauce, a real promotional dipping sauce the chain had sold back in 1998 as a tie-in for the Disney film Mulan. Rick delivers a rant about needing that sauce back, about it being the whole series arc, and it was written as a joke about how flimsy a hero's motivation can be. Except the fans took it literally. The demand became so loud that on the 7th of October, 2017, McDonald's actually brought the sauce back for a single day, and they badly underestimated it. Most locations received only a tiny handful of packets. Enormous crowds showed up, were turned away, and it curdled into real chaos. People chanting in parking lots, police being called, the story making national news. McDonald's had to apologize publicly and bring the sauce back later in far larger quantities. A cartoon's joke about a meaningless motivation had reached out of the screen and caused a small, real-world riot over a dipping sauce. There is something almost perfectly on brand about that, a story about the emptiness of desire accidentally proving its own thesis in the parking lot of a McDonald's. One more from the shallow end before we start descending, and it is one of the saddest ideas the series ever built, dressed up as a pure comedy premise. The Me-Seeks. In the 1st season, in an episode called Me-Seeks and Destroy, Rick hands the family a Me-Seeks box. You press the button, and out pops a friendly blue creature who exists for one purpose, to fulfill a single task you assign it, and the moment that task is complete, it vanishes from existence, painlessly, gratefully. That is the joke. But the premise immediately turns bleak, because it turns out that continued existence is agony for a Me-Seeks. They are not built to linger. When Jerry asks his Me-Seeks to help take 2 strokes off his golf game, a task he is far too incompetent to ever complete, the Me-Seeks cannot die, and so it lingers, and it suffers, and it starts summoning more Me-Seeks to help it finish the impossible task. And those Me-Seeks suffer too, until you have a whole population of blue creatures in existential horror, willing to kill just to be allowed to stop existing. Existence is pain to a Me-Seeks, one of them says, and Rick and Morty means it. That is the surface layer, over and over. A toy, a gag, a bright color, and underneath it, a small meditation on suffering and the mercy of ceasing to be. Now we start to go down, past the light, into the layer where Rick and Morty did the single darkest thing it has ever done, and then dared you to keep laughing. It happens in the 6th episode of the 1st season, Rick Potion number 9, And if you have never had this one explained to you properly, it changes how you watch everything that comes after. The setup is small and silly. Morty wants a girl at school to like him, so Rick whips up a love serum, and the serum works, and then it does not stop working. It mutates, it jumps from person to person like a virus, and it turns the entire population of Earth first into a mob obsessed with Morty, and then, when Rick tries to cure it, into grotesque, twisted, fleshy monsters. They get nicknamed Cronenbergs after David Cronenberg, the director who built a whole career out of horrifying transformations of the human body. Rick tries a second cure, it makes everything worse, and then he does the thing that tells you exactly who this man is. He gives up on the entire planet. Here is where the premise stops being a joke and becomes the engine of everything dark that follows. Rick cannot fix this Earth, so he simply finds another one. He opens a portal to a nearly identical parallel dimension, a reality where the Cronenberg apocalypse never happened, and, crucially, where that world's version of Rick and Morty have just died in a freak accident in the garage. Two fresh corpses, the exact same age, the exact same faces, nobody around to notice the swap. So the two of them walk into a stranger's house that is identical to their own, drag the dead bodies of their own doubles out into the backyard and bury them. Morty, 14 years old, has to dig a grave for himself and lower his own dead face into the dirt while his grandfather smokes and waits. Then they walk inside and take over these dead people's lives, sit down at this other family's dinner table, and never tell anyone. That is the actual premise from episode 6 onward. The Rick and Morty you have been watching for years in the house you think of as the main setting are refugees living in a dead family's home, wearing a dead boy's life. What makes this land, what turns it from a cheap shock into a piece of quiet brutality, is that Morty never gets let off the hook, and the knife takes 2 whole episodes to twist. In the 8th episode of that first season, Rick's Minutes, there is a subplot that has nothing to do with the main gag. Summer, Morty's older sister, discovers she was an unplanned pregnancy, that her parents only stayed together because of her, and she decides to run away from home. Morty, trying to stop her, tells her the truth about himself, and it is maybe the most important speech in the entire series. He takes her up to the backyard, to a specific patch of dirt, and he tells her that he is not her real brother. Her real brother, the Morty she grew up with, died in the garage, and this Morty, the one standing in front of her, buried him right there, in that spot, a few weeks ago. And then he says the thing the whole series is built around. He tells her that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody is going to die. And then he suggests they go back inside and watch television. Come watch TV. That is the thesis. That is the beating, nihilist heart of Rick and Morty, delivered by the sweetest character in it, standing over the grave he dug for himself to comfort a suicidal teenager. And it works, it calms her down. Here, the only comfort available is the admission that nothing means anything, so you might as well not take your pain too seriously. I think that is the real reason this show connected the way it did, and it is worth turning over before we go deeper. On the surface, it looks like a rude, fast, clever science fiction comedy for teenagers, and it absolutely is that. But underneath, from the very first season, it is one long argument about whether a life can matter in a universe where you are infinitely replaceable. And the horror of Rick Potion number 9 is that it makes the answer feel like no. And the strange grace of Rick's Minutes is that it suggests maybe the answer being no is survivable. Even funny, if you have someone to watch television with. Everything else in the iceberg, every alien and council and clone we are about to go through, is that one question turned over and over, looking for a different answer and mostly not finding one. Let us drift a little sideways now into the Bestiary, because before Rick and Morty became a dense continuity machine, it was mostly a factory for strange creatures, and a lot of its most beloved corners live in this middle water, halfway between a throwaway joke and a genuine idea. Take Scary Terry. He shows up in the 2nd episode of the whole series, Lawnmower Dog, and he is, on paper, a lawsuit-proof parody of Freddy Krueger, a knife-fingered monster who stalks people through their dreams and punctuates every threat with the word bitch. Rick and Morty end up chasing him through nested layers of dreams, a dream inside a dream inside a dream, which is the series cheerfully lifting the structure of Inception and running it at double speed. But then the episode does the thing that separates this show from 100 other parody cartoons. Instead of just defeating Scary Terry, they follow him into his own dream, and they find him small and anxious and insecure, worried he is not scary enough, worried about his job, and they comfort him. They befriend the monster by discovering he is just as frightened as everyone else. It is a tiny thing, 3 minutes of screen time, but it is the same move the writers keep making. Look at the scary thing closely enough and you find a wound. That same episode gives us one of the sweetest and most secretly sad arcs of the early years, the story of the family dog. Rick, mildly annoyed that the dog is not smart enough to use the bathroom door, builds him a little intelligence-boosting helmet, almost as an afterthought. The dog, named Snuffles, gets smarter and smarter, and then keeps getting smarter until he is fully self-aware and understands exactly what his position in the household has been. He renames himself Snowball because, he says, if he is going to be treated like a pet, he wants a pet's name, and he builds a suit of mechanical armor and leads a brief uprising of intelligent dogs against their human owners. And the part that stays with you is this. When Snowball finally has the humans at his mercy, he chooses not to hurt them, specifically because Morty was always kind to him, and rather than rule over a conquered Earth, he opens a portal and leaves, taking the other intelligent dogs to found their own civilization in a dimension of their own. He is not the family pet anymore. He walked out into infinity to build a better world than the one that leashed him. For a joke about a dog in a helmet, that is a startlingly gentle piece of writing about dignity and the way we treat the creatures that depend on us. Then there is Anatomy Park, the first Christmas episode, which aired on the 16th of December, 2013, only 2 weeks into the show's life. And it is one of the purest examples of the early formula, which was to take a beloved older film and gleefully desecrate it. The film here is Fantastic Voyage, the old science fiction story about shrinking a crew down and injecting them into a human body, crossed with Jurassic Park. Rick shrinks Morty down and injects him into the body of a homeless man named Reuben. And inside Reuben, Rick has built an actual theme park, Anatomy Park. Except instead of dinosaurs, the attractions are diseases, tuberculosis and hepatitis and bubonic plague. All of them breaking loose exactly the way the dinosaurs do in the movie it is spoofing. And then, on Christmas, Reuben dies, the park inside him collapses, and the survivors have to be blown out of his body as his giant naked corpse floats over the city. It is grotesque and silly and completely committed to the bit, and it tells you that here, even the Christmas special ends with a man dying alone so a cartoon can finish its Jurassic Park joke. The first season keeps introducing these little worlds. In an episode called Raising Gazerpazorp, Rick buys Morty a robotic companion, and Morty, being a lonely teenage boy, does what a lonely teenage boy does, and the machine turns out to be a reproductive device. And Morty becomes a father. His son, Morty Jr., is half alien from a planet called Gazorpazorp. And he ages to full adulthood in a single day, going from infant to a violent, brooding young man to, eventually, a mellow older artist, compressing a whole human lifetime into an afternoon. Meanwhile, Rick and Summer travel to Gazorpazorp itself and find a society split brutally by gender, the males kept penned like violent animals, the females running a hyper-advanced civilization in secret. It is broad satire and it is uneven, but tucked inside it is that recurring interest in how quickly a life can run its course and how little control any of us have over the circumstances we are born into. And I have to mention the devil because he is one of the better one-off ideas of these early years. In the 9th episode of the first season, Something Rick This Way Comes, a character named Mr. Needful opens an antique shop in town, and Mr. Needful is, quite literally, the devil, voiced by Alfred Molina. His whole scheme is a riff on old horror anthologies. He gives people cursed objects for free, a camera that keeps you young but ages the photographs into monsters, that kind of thing, always with an ironic curse attached. And Rick, being Rick, cannot stand this, so he opens a rival shop directly across the way that scientifically removes every curse for free, systematically dismantling the devil's entire business model out of pure spite. It is a small, funny war between magic and science, and it ends with Rick and Summer, of all people, cornering the devil and beating him up in the street. This show almost never lets a supernatural force win. Rick will always find the science underneath the magic and use it to ruin the magic's day. Before we leave the shallow water, there is one more creature worth naming because it produced one of the only genuine musical hits in the whole run. and that is the Cromulons. In a second season episode called Get Swifty, gigantic planet-sized heads appear in the sky over Earth and demand, in the manner of a cosmic talent show, that the planet show them what it has got. Losing planets are simply destroyed. It is American Idol with the stakes of a doomsday weapon. The judges are floating heads the size of continents, and the only way to survive is to produce a good enough song. So Rick and Morty write one on the spot, a deliberately crude, catchy thing called Get Swifty, and it saves the world. The joke is that the fate of humanity comes down to whether a drunk scientist and a nervous teenager can bang out a passable pop song under pressure. And the deeper joke, the one this show is always making, is that this is not really less dignified than any other reason a civilization might survive or fall. In an indifferent universe, being saved by a novelty song is as meaningful as being saved by anything else. There is a whole layer of this series that exists almost outside the story, and if you have only watched casually, you might not even realize how much of what you love was never really written down at all. I am talking about the interdimensional cable. Twice, once in that first season in 60 Minutes, and again in the second season in one called Interdimensional Cable 2, Tempting Fate, Rick hooks the family television up to a receiver that pulls in programming from across the entire multiverse. Every channel from every version of Earth at once. And then the family simply sits on the couch and channel surfs through the strangest television imaginable. Advertisements for real fake doors, a man named Ants in My Eyes. Johnson, who runs an electronics store while, as the name suggests, having ants in his eyes so he cannot see anything he is selling or whether the store is even on fire. A version of Garfield called Gazorpa Zorpfield. A little alien who just keeps repeating that he is a real hungry little boy. It is nonsense, gorgeous, uninhibited nonsense. The fact that recontextualizes all of it is this. Those segments were to a very large degree not scripted. Justin Roiland improvised them, the production would roll the recording, and Roiland would riff as these characters, inventing the ads and the shows and the catchphrases on the fly, often for many minutes at a stretch, and then the animators would go away and animate whatever he had come up with. Some of the most quoted material in the entire series is essentially a man alone in a booth making things up. This connects to something bigger about how Rick and Morty is actually made, a process the crew has called retroscripting. Rather than locking every line in a finished script and having actors read it exactly, the production frequently works from a looser outline and lets the performers, especially Roiland as Rick, improvise around it. And then the writers reverse engineer the final animation from the best takes. That is a big part of why Rick sounds the way he does, why his speech stumbles and doubles back and trails off mid-thought and lands on a burp. It was not written to sound spontaneous. A lot of it actually was spontaneous. The interdimensional cable episodes also hide one of the more moving pieces of the whole series, and it is easy to miss because it is buried in the middle of all that improvised silliness. In the second season episode Morty Night Run, Rick and Morty stop at an alien arcade called Blips and Chits, and Rick sits Morty down in front of a game called Roy, A Life Well Lived. It is a full immersion simulator. You put on the headset and you live an entire human life as a man named Roy. Morty puts it on and from his perspective lives Roy's whole existence, growing up, getting a job selling carpet, falling in love, getting married, having a son, surviving cancer, getting old, and finally dying. Decades of a life lived inside a few minutes of arcade time, and then he pulls the headset off. Shaken, disoriented, having just experienced a complete mortal life and its end, while Rick just critiques his score and tells him he did not sell enough carpet. It is played for a laugh, and it is a laugh, but sit for even a second with what the game actually is, an entire human life reduced to a high score at an arcade, and it becomes an object of quiet horror in the series. Rick can hand a teenager a full lifetime, complete with love and grief and death, as a way to kill 20 minutes. To him, a whole life really is just a game you can put down. What I find so telling about this middle layer, the cable and the arcade and the improvised nonsense, is that it is where the writers are having the most fun and making the least effort to seem meaningful, and yet it keeps accidentally saying the same thing everything else says out loud, that a life can be watched from the outside, that consciousness might be cheap, that from a high enough vantage point, from Rick's vantage point, the difference between a real man's decades and a game cartridge collapses to almost nothing. Rick and Morty hides its bleakest idea inside its silliest format, hands it to you between two ads for fake doors, and trusts that some of you will feel the floor drop out even while you are laughing. Now we go a little deeper into the one relationship that tells you Rick Sanchez was, at some point, a different man than the one we meet. That relationship is Birdperson. He is exactly what he sounds like, a stoic humanoid bird, and he is introduced almost casually as Rick's oldest and closest friend, a comrade from some vague and violent past that early episodes only gesture at. There are references to the two of them fighting together in a galactic war, to a resistance against a tyrannical galactic federation, to a whole chapter of Rick's life that happened long before he ever crashed back into his daughter's garage. Birdperson speaks slowly and seriously and means every word, which makes him the perfect foil for Rick, who means almost nothing he says. And it is Birdperson, back in that first season finale, who translates the catchphrase and tells Morty that his grandfather's cheerful little slogan is actually a confession of unbearable pain. He is the one person in the universe who reads Rick accurately, which is exactly why the writers have to take him away. The taking away happens in the second season finale, The Wedding Squanchers, and it is the moment the stakes turned real. Birdperson is getting married, his bride is a human woman named Tammy, one of Summer's friends, and the whole strange interstellar family gathers on a distant planet to celebrate, and for about half an episode it is almost warm, almost hopeful, the closest thing to a happy occasion the series has ever staged. And then, during the ceremony, Tammy stands up and reveals that the entire relationship was a cover. She is a deep cover agent of the Galactic Federation, the very authoritarian empire Rick and Birdperson once fought. And the wedding was an elaborate trap to capture Rick and his associates in one place. Federation troops pour in. In the chaos, Tammy shoots Birdperson, apparently killing him on the spot, cutting down Rick's best friend at what was supposed to be the happiest moment of his life, purely as an operational maneuver. It is a real gut punch, and it ends the season with the family scattered, the Federation in control, and Rick eventually turning himself in to protect the people he loves, which is the first time we ever see him make that trade. But Birdperson does not stay dead, and what happens to him instead is arguably worse. In the third season premiere, in a scene tucked after the credits, we learn that the Federation recovered his body and rebuilt him with cybernetics, converting Rick's oldest friend into a mind-controlled weapon called Phoenixperson, a grieving, half-machine ghost of the man he was, now pointed at his former comrades. Later seasons would return to this thread, working toward a partial restoration of who he had been, and I do not want to overstate where that arc lands because it has kept getting adjusted, but the emotional core of it is fixed, and it is devastating. The one being who ever truly knew Rick, who could hear the pain under the catchphrase, gets shot at his own wedding by someone he loved and trusted, and then gets turned into a machine and turned against his best friend. If you ever wonder why Rick keeps everyone at arm's length, why he sabotages his own attachments before they can deepen, Birdperson is a large part of the answer. Rick has already lived through what happens when he lets someone all the way in. The universe took that person, killed him, and rebuilt him into a weapon. After that, arm's length starts to look less like coldness and more like a man who has learned exactly what caring costs him. That is the pattern I keep noticing as we sink through these layers. Every time Rick gets something real, a friend, a wife, a version of family that might actually hold, it is taken away in the cruelest available manner, and then we watch him metabolize the loss into another layer of armor. Birdperson is the first big example, the first time the writing says clearly that Rick's nihilism is not a philosophy he arrived at in a library, it is scar tissue. He talks like nothing matters because everything that ever mattered to him was taken, and talking like nothing matters is the only way he has found to keep functioning inside that grief. The second season is where the comedy really started sneaking up on you about mental illness, and there are 3 episodes in particular that, taken together, form the clearest picture of who Rick actually is under the genius. The first is a deceptively fun one called Total Recall. The house is invaded by shape-shifting alien parasites, and these parasites have a very specific power. They can only implant false memories that are pleasant. Every time one of them appears, the family suddenly remembers a warm, funny, affectionate shared history with this new person. A wacky uncle, a lovable friend, a comic relief sidekick, and the memory feels completely real. The parasites multiply through nostalgia, through the exact kind of feel-good flashback a lesser cartoon would be built on. And the way the family finally figures out who is real and who is a parasite is the darkest, truest joke in the episode. They realize the parasites can only create good memories, so anyone they have a truly bad memory of, anyone connected to a moment of cruelty or embarrassment or pain, must be real, because the parasites are incapable of manufacturing anything unpleasant. Real relationships have bad memories in them. Only a fantasy is all warmth. That is the test they use to survive. And that test produces the single most infamous casualty in the whole run, a character named Mr. Poopy Butthole. He looks like a cheerful little cartoon mascot. He has been sitting at the dinner table this whole episode. Everyone loves him. And by the logic of the parasite hunt, Beth becomes convinced he is one of them and shoots him. Except he is not a parasite. He is completely real. He was always real. Beth just shot a beloved family friend in the stomach based on a flawed theory, and he survives, badly wounded, and he does not really forgive them, and his slow recovery becomes an ongoing bit for years afterward. Dan Harmon has floated a half-joking idea that Mr. Poopy Butthole is some kind of fourth-dimensional being who turns up around temporal disturbances, and that is fun to chew on, but I would not carry it as hard fact because it has mostly been left as a delightful mystery. What matters is the gut punch under the gag. The one member of the family who was truly, uncomplicatedly good got shot for it, because the instinct to distrust warmth runs so deep here that it will gun down the real thing by mistake. Then there is Tiny Rick from an episode called Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, and this one is a masterclass in hiding a scream inside a party. Rick transfers his consciousness into a younger clone body, a teenage version of himself, ostensibly to go undercover at Summer and Morty's high school. Tiny Rick is a blast. He is cool, he is energetic, the students love him, he is the fun young grandpa everyone wishes they had. But there is a catch, and it gets doled out slowly. The young clone brain is beginning to overwrite Rick's actual mind, and the real Rick, the old man's consciousness, is trapped and slowly being erased, and some deeper part of him knows it. And the way that buried part tries to signal for rescue is unbearable. Tiny Rick keeps unconsciously writing lyrics, dark-scrawled poetry, songs about how his real body is dying in a vat in the garage, about letting him out, about needing help, and the teenagers around him just cheer because they think it is an edgy, cool performance. He is literally singing that he is trapped and dying and begging to be freed, and his audience treats it as entertainment. If you want the whole show in one image, it is that, a cry for help so well disguised as a fun bit that everyone applauds instead of helping. It is the catchphrase problem again, scaled up into an entire episode. And that brings us to the episode I think is the darkest thing Rick and Morty has ever aired, one from the second season called Autoerotic Assimilation. And I want to describe it carefully because it is not a joke. It is the series dropping the act entirely for about 90 seconds at the end. Earlier in the episode, Rick reconnects with an old lover named Unity, and Unity is not a person, Unity is a hive mind, a single consciousness that spreads across entire planets by assimilating every individual it touches, so that when Rick is with Unity, he is, in a sense, with an entire world at once. It is the perfect relationship for a man who cannot tolerate being truly known by any single person. Intimacy at planetary scale with no one individual close enough to hurt him. And for a while, it is euphoric and destructive and alive. But Unity realizes that being with Rick brings out the worst version of itself, that he drags it toward chaos and cruelty, and so Unity leaves him, and it leaves behind a breakup note that is genuinely kind, telling him that he is like a poison, that it has to choose its own health, and that it hopes he finds someone. And Rick goes home, alone, to his garage. What follows has no dialogue and no music for most of its length. He assembles a device on his workbench, a laser aimed at his own forehead, sets it on a timer, rests his head down into the path of the beam, and closes his eyes to die. And at the last possible instant, drunk and exhausted, he passes out, and his head slumps off the platform, and the laser fires harmlessly into the wall, and he does not wake up to try again. He just sleeps. There is no comment, There is no joke to undercut it. It simply shows you plainly that the smartest man in the universe tried to kill himself in his garage after being left by the one partner who could hold all of him at once, and that he only survived by accident. That scene, I think, is the key to the entire iceberg, and it is why I wanted to reach it before we go down into the cold, plotty machinery of the deep lore. Everything below this point, the Citadel and the Council and Rick Prime and the central finite curve, all of that vast cosmic architecture exists in service of a man who once tried to die on his workbench and failed. This series can be as clever and as galaxy-spanning as it wants, but at the bottom of Rick is that garage, that laser, that timer, and the terrible ordinariness of a brilliant person who has decided more than once that he does not want to be here. Keep that in mind as we descend, because the machinery only means anything if you remember what it is wrapped around. So let us go into the machinery, because this is where the iceberg gets truly cold and strange, and it starts with a single idea that reframes the whole story. There is not one Rick, there are essentially infinite Ricks, because the multiverse is infinite, and because every version of Rick is defined by being a genius who abandons his family and masters reality. There exists an unimaginable number of parallel Ricks, each with his own Morty, scattered across creation. And at some point, generations of these Ricks did something about that. They built a hidden society, a station outside the normal flow of any one universe, and they populated it with themselves. They called it the Citadel of Ricks. Thousands upon thousands of Ricks and Mortys living together with their own economy, their own police, their own bureaucracy, their own slums, all of it staffed entirely by variations of the same two people, and it is governed by a body called the Council of Ricks, an elite committee who claim authority over all the others, who issue laws and hunt rogue Ricks and treat the collective as something like a nation. Now here's the crucial thing, the piece of deep canon that most reorganizes how you understand the entire series. Our Rick, the one we follow, hates the Citadel. He refuses to join the Council. He considers the whole idea of Ricks banding together a betrayal of what being a Rick is supposed to mean, which is to answer to no one. And the reason there can even be a Citadel, the reason infinite Ricks can find each other and cluster together, is a piece of hidden infrastructure called the central finite curve. This is worth slowing down for because it is easy to get wrong. The multiverse is infinite in every direction, containing every possible version of every possible thing. But the Ricks did not want to live in a truly infinite multiverse, because in a truly infinite multiverse, there are countless universes where Rick is not the smartest one, where someone or something outclasses him, where he is not special. So the early Ricks built a wall. The central finite curve is a vast machine that walls off from the whole of infinity, only the specific subset of universes in which Rick Sanchez is the smartest creature alive. Everything inside the wall is a reality Rick dominates. Everything outside it, the actual unbounded infinity, is left out. The Ricks chose to live inside a curated, gerrymandered slice of creation, one custom built so that they would always be the cleverest thing in the room. Sit with what that actually says about the character, because it is one of the most devastating facts in the show, and it hides in plain sight. Rick Sanchez, the man who preaches that nothing matters and that ego is a prison, is a member of a species-wide project whose entire purpose is to guarantee his own supremacy. The Ricks did not just accept an indifferent universe, they built a machine to edit the universe down to the part that flatters them. All of Rick's nihilism, all his contempt for meaning and specialness, sits inside a structure secretly engineered to keep him the most special being in his reality. The writers waited years to make this explicit, and when they did, it turned Rick's whole philosophy into a kind of cope, a story a scared man tells himself while living inside a fortress designed to protect his ego from the one thing that would shatter it, which is the discovery that he is not actually the center of anything. The Citadel gets its greatest single portrait in a third season episode whose on-screen title is Tales from the Citadel, but which everyone knows as the Ricklantis mix-up, and it is routinely ranked among the best episodes ever produced. It leaves our Rick and Morty behind almost entirely, and instead tells an anthology of small stories about ordinary Ricks and Mortys living in the rebuilt Citadel, and it plays like a bleak, gorgeous piece of social science fiction. There is a story about Mortys being processed like factory stock. There is a Rick working a soul-crushing assembly line. There is a hardened cop, Rick, partnered with an idealistic rookie Morty on a tour through the Citadel's underclass. And there's one story I have to single out because it is the cruelest and most perfect thing in the whole episode, and that is Simple Rick. Simple Rick is exactly what he sounds like, a Rick who, unlike almost every other Rick, chose the simple life, the family, the happiness, the ordinary human contentment that our Rick threw away. And the Citadel has found a use for him. There is a wildly popular snack food, a wafer cookie sold under the brand Simple Ricks, that promises the taste of a simpler, happier life. And the way they manufacture that flavor is that they have this particular Simple Rick imprisoned in a facility, hooked into a machine, and they force him to relive over and over a single perfect memory, the memory of a specific afternoon holding his infant daughter Beth on her birthday, feeling completely, uncomplicatedly happy. His brain, flooded with that one pure feeling, secretes a chemical, and they harvest the chemical and they bake it into cookies, and they sell his happiest moment as a snack. It is a satire of nostalgia and factory labor so precise it almost hurts. A man's love for his daughter drained out of him and sold by the box. And it tells you what the Citadel really is underneath the science fiction. It is a machine for taking the one genuine thing a Rick might have, his capacity for simple love, and converting it into product. Even here, especially here, the argument is that the systems we build to organize ourselves are mostly engines for extracting the real feeling out of people and selling it back to them. If the Citadel is the show's great tragic setting, then the being who eventually breaks it is its great tragic figure, and that is Evil Morty. Now, we made a whole separate video about the theory of who Evil Morty really is, so I'm not going to relitigate every frame of that argument tonight, but he is far too important to the deep lore to skip, so let me lay out what has actually been shown, plainly, and keep the speculation clearly labeled as speculation. Evil Morty first appears near the end of the first season in an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. On the surface, that episode is about a rogue Rick murdering other Ricks across the Citadel, and our Rick becomes the prime suspect. But the twist is that the killer Rick is not the mastermind at all. He is a puppet. The real intelligence behind the killings is his Morty, a small, calm, eye patch-wearing Morty who has been secretly controlling a Rick, using a Rick as a tool, which is the exact reversal of the entire natural order of this universe. Everywhere else, Ricks use Mortys. Here, for the first time, a Morty is using a Rick. He gets away clean at the end of that episode, walking off into the crowd, planted as a seed and left to sit unexplained for a long time. He resurfaces at the end of the Ricklantis mix-up, and this is the reveal that made him a legend. Remember, that episode is full of small stories about the Citadel, and one of them follows an idealistic Morty running for president of the Citadel in a democratic election, an underdog candidate promising to end the mistreatment of Mortys. He wins, and in the final moments, as he takes power, we see him remove a disguise, and it is him, the eye patch Morty, Evil Morty, now the elected leader of the entire society of Ricks. He has files on his rivals. He has the opposition purged, bodies dumped out of an airlock while a wistful song plays. A Morty, the eternal underclass of this universe, has climbed to the top of the Rick's own government through their own democratic process and turned their machine against them. It is a stunning, chilling sequence, and it repositions the whole series. The Ricks always assumed the great threat was other Ricks. They never seriously considered that the real revolutionary would be one of the disposable grandsons they had been grinding up for parts. And then comes the payoff, in the finale of the 5th season, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, which is one of the densest single episodes in the whole run, and where a great deal of the deepest lore finally gets spoken out loud. Evil Morty's true goal turns out not to be ruling the Citadel at all. Ruling the Citadel was never the point, because the Citadel is inside the wall, inside the central finite curve, and to Evil Morty the wall is the real prison. His entire long game has been to escape it. He gets access to our Rick's mind, extracts the schematics he needs, overloads the Citadel's dimensional drive and uses it to punch an actual hole straight through the central Finite curve, tearing open a passage out of the curated slice of reality where Rick is always king and into the true, unbounded, infinite multiverse beyond, the part the Ricks walled themselves off from precisely because they could not bear it. And as he goes, he lays out the thesis that recontextualizes every Rick and Morty pairing in the show. He argues that the entire structure, Rick's and Morty's, was never a family. It was a system. Ricks are geniuses who need a certain kind of companion, and Mortis are, in his framing, bred and used as cover, as camouflage, as emotional shielding, generation after generation. A Morty who develops genuine free will, who refuses the role, is a defect in the system, and the Ricks have a word for a Morty like that. They call him evil. That is the knife in the whole thing. He is not called Evil Morty because he does evil. He is called Evil Morty because he woke up, and in a system built on using Mortys, a Morty who wakes up and walks out is the worst thing that can happen. Then he steps through the hole he has torn in the wall, out into real infinity, and he is gone. And I have to be careful and honest with you at this point because this is exactly the sort of place a video like this can start inventing things. What has been confirmed is what I just described. What the series has never confirmed is Evil Morty's exact origin, which specific Rick's Morty he originally was, or whether there is any special relationship between him and our Rick in particular. There is an enormously popular fan theory, and it is a beautiful theory, that Evil Morty was originally the very first Morty that our Rick C-137, ever had, the one who lived through the earliest traumas alongside him, and that his coldness is the direct product of being the Morty closest to the worst of Rick. It is a compelling reading, and it would make the whole saga rhyme perfectly. But it has not been confirmed, and I am not going to narrate it to you as though it happened, because it did not on screen. What is real is simpler and maybe better. A member of the most exploited class in the multiverse understood the shape of his own cage more clearly than any Rick ever did, spent seasons patiently building the tools to break it, and walked out into a freedom his oppressors were too proud and too frightened to ever seek. He is out there right now, past the wall, and he has been left as the one truly open door in the story. We have spent a lot of time on Ricks and Mortys, so let us turn to the person who sits between them, the one the whole tragedy actually orbits. And that is Beth. She is Rick's daughter and Morty's mother. And for the first couple of seasons, she reads as the most stable adult in the house. A competent horse surgeon, exhausted, drinking a little too much wine, trapped in a marriage to Jerry that she is always half a step from leaving. But the deeper the story goes, the clearer it becomes that Beth is her father's daughter in ways that are genuinely disturbing. And the episode that cracks her open is a third season one called The ABCs of Beth. It contains a reveal about Beth's childhood that is one of the show's true horror stories, and it centers on a place called Froopyland. When Beth was a little girl, she was not a sweet child. She was, the episode strongly implies, a violent and possibly psychopathic one, cruel to other children in ways that frightened even Rick. And Rick's solution, being Rick, was not therapy and not patience. He built her a pocket dimension. He created an entire candy-colored fantasy world called Froopyland, a bright, gravity-optional playground where nothing could truly hurt her, and, crucially, where she could not truly hurt anyone else in the real world. He put his dangerous daughter in a beautiful cage and called it a gift, and here is the horror underneath the whimsy. Beth had a childhood friend, a boy named Tommy, and one day young Beth lured Tommy into Froopyland and left him there, trapped, alone, a real human child abandoned in a fantasy dimension. And Tommy did not die. Tommy survived for years into adulthood, in a world with no other people, and the way he survived is the thing the episode makes you slowly understand. He survived by producing his own offspring and living off them. Generation after generation, a lone man turning a paradise into a private hell just to stay alive. It is one of the darkest single ideas the show has ever buried inside a bright color palette, and it recasts Beth entirely. The competent mother has, sleeping inside her, the same capacity for casual monstrousness as her father, and Rick has always known it because he is the one who built the cage to contain it. That sets up the reveal that turned Beth into one of the show's great unsolved mysteries, and I want to handle this one precisely because it is exactly the kind of thing people get wrong. At the end of the ABCs of Beth, Rick offers his adult daughter an escape hatch from her unhappy, ordinary life. He offers to build her a clone, a perfect duplicate, so that one Beth can stay home and be a mother and a wife, and the other Beth can leave and go have wild adventures across the galaxy, free. He tells her he can make the copy completely identical, indistinguishable even to herself. And then the episode ends without ever showing us her choice. We do not see whether she took the deal. For a whole season, it just hangs there. The answer comes in the 4th season finale, Star Mort, Rick Turn of the Jerry, when a hardened, gun-toting space Beth returns to Earth and comes face to face with the Beth who stayed home. And both of them, understandably, want to know which one is the original and which one is the clone. And Rick's answer is the important part, the part that makes this permanent. Rick says that he scrambled the records on purpose, he deliberately erased the information, ran it through a randomizer so that even he does not know which Beth is the copy. Both of them have a matching neck scar from the procedure. Both of them have the same memories, the same feelings, the same claim to being the real one. And that line has held ever since. It refuses, absolutely refuses, to tell you which Beth is the clone, and it refuses on purpose because the whole point is that the question is meaningless. If a copy is perfect down to the last thought and the last wound, then there is no fact of the matter about which one is real. They are both Beth. And so I am not going to tell you which is which, and you should be a little suspicious of anyone who claims to know, because that ambiguity was built as a permanent feature, not a puzzle to be solved. What gets me about the two Beths is what it does to Rick, because it is the clearest confession of his own sickness the show ever stages without him having to say a word. Think about what he actually did. Faced with a daughter he loved, whose unhappiness he could not fix, Rick's solution was to duplicate her so that neither version would have to choose, so that the leaving and the staying could both happen and no loss would have to be felt. He would rather split a person in two than watch her make a hard decision and live with it. It is the same instinct as the portal gun, the same instinct as the replacement dimension. When something might hurt, when something might require sitting in an irreversible loss, Rick reaches for a copy, a swap, a second version, anything to avoid the one thing the whole multiverse cannot give him, which is the ability to keep the specific, singular, unrepeatable person in front of him. He can make infinite Beths. He just cannot bear to lose the one he has, and so he makes sure he never technically has to. And now we are at the bottom of the iceberg, in the cold and the dark, at the single wound that everything else has been circling for over a decade. To understand it, we have to talk about a name the early seasons never even whispered, a name that turns out to be the origin of the portal gun, the origin of Rick's grief, and the origin of the man himself. We have to talk about Diane, and we have to talk about Rick Prime. For years, the backstory got teased and then withheld. There was a version of the story planted early, most memorably in the 3rd season premiere, an episode with the pun title The Rickshank Rickdemption, which, by the way, aired as one of the great stunts in television history, dropped completely unannounced on the 1st of April 2017 as an Adult Swim April Fool's surprise, so that fans who had been waiting years for a new season suddenly discovered it was already airing. In that episode, Rick, imprisoned and being mind probed by a Galactic Federation agent, appears to reveal his origin. He shows a memory of a young Rick, a wife, a daughter, a happy little family, and a bomb, a rival Rick arriving from another dimension and killing his wife and child, and the surviving Rick swearing revenge and inventing portal travel to hunt the killer across all of reality. And then, in the same episode, Rick sneers that the whole story was fake, a fabrication he invented on the spot to manipulate his interrogator. For years, that was the state of things. Fans did not know if the murdered family was real or a lie Rick told, and the ambiguity was the point. The truth finally got confirmed, and it came gradually across the later seasons, and here is what is now canon, stated plainly. Rick's home dimension, his true original reality, is the one designated C-137, and in that dimension, Rick had a wife named Diane and a young daughter, this timeline's Beth. And one day, another Rick, a Rick from a different reality, came to his home and sent a bomb, and that bomb killed Diane and killed his little girl in an instant. This other Rick is the one eventually named Rick Prime, and Rick Prime is not just any variant. He is, in a sense, the purest and most terrible Rick of all, because Rick Prime is the Rick who looked at the same universe our Rick looked at and drew the coldest possible conclusion, which is that attachment, family, love, all of it is a weakness to be discarded, and who then went a step further and decided to punish other versions of himself who had not discarded it. Our Rick, C-137, was a Rick who had a family and loved them. Rick Prime murdered that family specifically because our Rick had dared to have one. It was not random, it was a statement, and that murder is the true origin of everything. The portal gun, the thing the entire series runs on, was not invented for adventure or curiosity. Rick built interdimensional travel, mastered the multiverse, made himself the smartest being across infinite realities, all as a weapon, all so that he could hunt one specific Rick across all of creation and make him pay. Every quip, every drunken adventure, every terrible thing our Rick has ever done sits on top of a decades-long revenge quest born from a bomb in a driveway. The nihilism, the drinking, the refusal to get close to anyone, the garage, the laser, all of it traces back to Diane. We spent years thinking Rick was a nihilist by temperament, a genius who had simply seen too much. The truth is smaller and more human and much sadder. He is a widower and a bereaved father who never stopped looking for the man who did it. And this next part is the one I most need to get exactly right, because it is the single most important negative fact in the entire show. The one that separates the people who understand this series from the people who half remember it. You might think, with an infinite multiverse and a portal gun, that Rick's grief has an obvious escape hatch. You might think, well, there are infinite realities, so somewhere out there is a universe where Diane never died, and Rick could simply go there and be with a living version of his wife. That seems like it should be true. It is not true. And the story went to deliberate, brutal lengths to make sure it could never be true. When Rick Prime is finally cornered, we learn what he did with his own genius. He built a weapon called the Omega Device, and the Omega Device does something nothing had ever been allowed to do before. It does not kill one target. It erases a target and every single version of that target across the entire infinite multiverse, simultaneously, permanently, and Rick Prime used it on Diane. He did not just kill our Rick's wife, he reached across all of infinity and deleted every Diane in every reality that ever was or could be, so that there is no universe anywhere in the whole of creation where a living Diane can be found. He took the one escape hatch the multiverse offered and he welded it shut out of pure contempt to make sure that his oldest rival could never, ever undo the loss. There is nowhere Rick can go to get her back. That door is closed in every world at once, and Rick Prime closed it on purpose. I want to state that clearly because it is the fact people most often get wrong about this show. The multiverse does not save Rick from his grief. His enemy made certain of it. The confrontation itself, the moment the whole series had been building toward, comes in the 7th season in an episode called Unmortricken. And it is worth walking through what actually happens because it is not the triumphant catharsis you might expect. And the writers know exactly what they are doing by denying you that. By this point, the hunt for Rick Prime has become an obsession Rick shares, of all people, with Evil Morty, because Evil Morty has his own reasons to want Rick Prime gone. The two of them, the two most dangerous beings in this pocket of reality, team up, and they win. They actually catch him. Evil Morty is the one who ultimately outmaneuvers and subdues Rick Prime, pinning the great villain in place, and then he steps back and lets our Rick have the kill. And Rick kills him. After decades, after everything, Rick finally puts his hands on the man who murdered Diane and ends him. And it is empty. It is hollow. Rick Prime, even cornered, even dying, refuses to give Rick the satisfaction of remorse or fear or acknowledgement. He mocks him to the end, points out that killing him changes nothing, that Diane is still gone, that the revenge Rick built his entire life around was always going to feel exactly this meaningless once it was finished, because the thing he actually wanted, his wife and daughter back, was never on the table. And then he is dead, and Rick is standing there having completed the one task that organized his whole existence. And the task is complete, and he is still alone, and Diane is still erased from everything, and now he does not even have the hunt to keep him moving. Evil Morty picks up the Omega Device and walks away with it, out the door, back into the free infinity beyond the wall, leaving Rick with nothing but the corpse of his revenge. That, to me, is the truest and bravest thing this series has ever done, and it is the note I most want you to carry out of the deep water. A lesser show would have made the death of Rick Prime a triumph, a fist pump, a healing. Rick and Morty makes it a void. It spends 10 years and an entire multiverse setting up the revenge, and then it shows you, unflinchingly, that revenge does not return what was taken. Diane does not come back when Rick Prime dies. The grief does not lift. The man Rick has been chasing his whole life turns out to have been, in a sense, the only thing giving that life shape. And once he is gone, Rick is left standing in the exact silence he has been running from since the beginning. The silence of a garage, a recording of a voice, a woman erased from every world, and no one left to blame. Everything above this in the iceberg, all the aliens and the councils and the arcades, all of it was scaffolding around this one hole in the middle of a man, and it took a decade to let you look all the way down into it. I open tonight with a house that greets Rick in his dead wife's voice, and now that you know who Diane is, I can finally tell you where that house sits and how he ended up back inside it, because it is among the most punishing sequences in the entire series, and it lives at the start of the 6th season in an episode called Solarix. To understand it, you have to hold on to the dimension bookkeeping we have been tracking all night, because the writing is very precise about this even when the fans are not. Our Rick is from dimension C137. That is his true original home, the one where Diane and his first Beth died. Our Morty, though, is not from C137. Our Morty comes from a different reality entirely, the world that got mutated into Cronenberg's back in that first season, the world the two of them fled. And the house they have lived in for most of the series, the garage, the dinner table, the whole familiar setting, is in yet a third dimension, the replacement dimension they moved into after the Cronenberg apocalypse, the one where they buried their own corpses. 3 different origins, one household, and almost none of the characters ever fully reckon with it. Solarix forces the reckoning. In the fight that spills out of the previous season, Rick's conflict with Rick Prime causes a catastrophe on a scale even this show rarely attempts. A device goes off that resets every portal, and the reset has a specific, cruel logic. Everyone who has ever traveled by portal is snapped back, instantly and against their will, to their true dimension of origin. The universe, in effect, sends everyone home, and home turns out to be the last place any of them want to be. Our Morty gets flung back to the ruined Cronenberg world he came from. Jerry gets flung back to his true original dimension, and Rick, our Rick, gets pulled all the way back to C-137, to the actual house where it all began, the house he has not set foot in for decades, the house where his real life ended. And the house is still there. It is derelict, half collapsed, sitting in a dead and abandoned reality. And when Rick walks through the door, the automated home system he built to speak in her voice still functions, and it welcomes him. It plays a recording. It greets him in Diane's voice, warm and casual and domestic. A little automated hello in the voice of a woman who has been erased from every reality in existence, still running on a loop in an empty ruin because nobody was ever there to turn it off. Rick stands in the wreckage of his first life and listens to his dead wife say hello to a room with no one in it. There is no monster to fight in that moment, no joke to land. It is just a man, at the absolute bottom of everything, confronted with the recorded ghost of the only thing he ever really wanted, in the shell of the home he built for her before another version of himself took her out of the universe forever. If you want to know why I called that the bottom of the iceberg in the very first minute, that is why. Everything else is plot. That is the wound with the bandages pulled off. The reset does something else too, something that had been set up for years, and that is it clarifies just how tangled and sad the family's living situation has always been. Because the Jerry who gets sent home is not simply relocated. There has always been a hard line between the family we follow and the versions of that family who got left behind in the various dimensions Rick abandoned. And it is a distinction the series wants you to keep straight. The original inhabitants of the worlds Rick discards do not vanish. They keep living, worse off for having lost their Rick and Morty, and every so often we check in on that suffering. The reset drags some of that history to the surface, and it does not go gently for everyone caught in it. Jerry in particular is put through the ringer, hunted by a bitter, weaponized version of himself from the world he was snapped back to, a Jerry who was left behind and curdled into something dangerous. And it is a dark little thread about the roads not taken, the versions of ourselves that are luckier selves stranded. What Solarix really does underneath the spectacle is refuse to let the family off the hook for the comfort they have been living in. For years, everyone settled into the sitcom of it, the familiar house, the familiar routine, and Solarix reaches in and reminds them that this house was never theirs, that Morty is not from here, that Rick is a refugee squatting 3 dimensions away from a grave he can never fill, and that the coziness of the whole premise was always built on top of loss and theft and abandonment. And then, because it is still Rick and Morty, they find their way back to each other and to the replacement house, and it resumes. But it resumes with a slightly colder honesty than before, having made everyone, characters and audience alike, walk back through the ruin they came from. Let us come up out of the coldest water for a while and drift through a stranger layer, the episodes where Rick and Morty turns its attention on its own rules, its own structure, its own nature as a television show, because some of the sharpest writing in the whole run lives here, in the moments where it looks directly at the machinery of itself. The best example, and one of the 2 episodes that won the show a Primetime Emmy, is from the 4th season, and it is called the Vat of Acid episode. On the surface, it is a simple grudge match between Rick and Morty. Morty, sick of a plan of Rick's that involves faking their deaths by hiding in a vat of fake acid, complains that it is stupid, and Rick, stung, challenges him to come up with a better idea and then builds him whatever he asks for out of spite. And what Morty asks for is a save point, like in a video game, a little remote that lets him save his position in time and, whenever something goes wrong, load back to that save moment and try again, consequence-free. Rick builds it sourly, and Morty has the time of his life, living recklessly, dying and reloading, romancing a woman and reloading when it goes badly, treating his whole life like a game he can replay until he gets it right. And then, at the end, Rick reveals the horror hiding inside the gift, and it is one of the most quietly monstrous ideas the show has ever slipped past an audience. The remote does not rewind time. Time travel, remember, is the one thing Rick refuses to do. What the remote actually does is far worse. Every time Morty pressed load, he did not undo anything. He jumped to a brand new parallel reality, one nearly identical to his own, that had been progressing right up to the saved moment, and he took over that reality's Morty by killing him and stepping into his life. Every single reload was a murder and a body swap. All those consequence-free do-overs left behind a trail of dozens of dead Mortys and dozens of grieving, abandoned realities, each one convinced its Morty had simply vanished. The save point was not mercy. It was a machine for making Morty do, over and over, casually, for fun, the exact horrifying thing Rick did once in desperation back in the Cronenberg episode. Rick built it specifically to teach Morty that lesson, to rub his nose in the true cost of the thing he thought he wanted, which is a life without consequences. There is no such thing, the episode says. Every consequence you dodge just lands on some other version of you. The show goes even further into self-examination in an episode from that same season called Never Ricking Morty, and this one is for the people who like their television to bite its own tail. Rick and Morty find themselves trapped aboard a sentient train, a literal story train, a locomotive that exists to generate narrative, and it is controlled by a villain named Storylord who wants to harness their adventures, their canon, their lore, the very thing you and I have been swimming through all night, and weaponize it. The entire episode is a running argument about serialization, about how a show like this accumulates a mythology, about how canon can become a trap that strangles the freedom that made the thing good in the first place. It is Rick and Morty openly wrestling with the danger of becoming exactly the kind of dense, continuity-choked saga that iceberg videos like this one exist to map. And the joke, the delicious joke, is that they made a great, tightly plotted episode about the perils of great, tight plotting, and then went right on building more lore anyway, because they could not help themselves, because the audience, us, we wanted the lore. We are Storylord. We are the ones feeding the train. I love this layer because it is where the writers are most honest about the bind they are in, and honest about the bind we are in as viewers. Rick and Morty began as a loose, anarchic, anything-goes comedy, where each episode could reset to 0 and nothing had to matter, which was, of course, the whole philosophy, nothing matters. So let us have fun. And then it got popular, and its fans, myself included, fell in love with the dark serialized parts, the Diane of it all, the evil Morty of it all, and demanded more. And every season it has had to carry more weight, more backstory, more consequence, more canon, which is the precise opposite of the freewheeling nihilist joy it was founded on. These meta-episodes are the show feeling that weight and saying so out loud, staging its own creative crisis as a train and a story monster, admitting that the more it means, the less free it is, and then choosing every time to mean more anyway, because meaning, it turns out, is the thing neither the series, nor its characters, nor its audience can actually stop reaching for, no matter how loudly any of them insist that nothing matters. There is a whole cluster of episodes that work as stress tests on Rick, little pressure chambers the writers build to reveal what he values by threatening to take it away, or by seeing who he respects when the mask slips, and drifting through them tells you a surprising amount about the man. Start with The Vindicators from a third season episode with the unwieldy title Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender. The Vindicators are a superhero team, a broad and loving parody of the Avengers, a squad of self-important cosmic do-gooders who summon Rick and Morty to help them defeat a great villain called World Ender. Morty is thrilled, a genuine fanboy, dazzled to be adventuring with real heroes. Rick, predictably, is contemptuous of the whole performance of heroism, and when the team arrives at World Ender's lair, they find him already dead, and they find that the lair has been rigged into an elaborate, murderous, Saw-style series of deadly traps and taunting puzzles, clearly built by someone who was there before them. It slowly dawns on everyone that Rick did all of it. On an earlier night, blackout drunk, Rick had come here alone, killed World Ender himself, and then, in a haze of alcohol and resentment, constructed this entire death game specifically to torment the Vindicators, a group he apparently despises, and then forgotten he had done it. He is his own episode's villain and does not even remember committing the crime. But buried in that episode is one of the more revealing character beats in the series, and it involves the team's most disrespected member, a lowly, mocked figure named Noob Noob, essentially the janitor, the gopher, the guy everyone talks down to. All the shining heroes ignore or belittle Noob Noob, and at the very end, when the ordeal is over, Rick delivers a genuine, heartfelt toast, and it is not to any of the celebrated heroes. It is to Noob Noob. Rick makes it clear that of everyone in that entire fancy organization, the only one he actually respects is the humble, overlooked worker that all the self-styled heroes treat as beneath them. It is a small thing, played partly for laughs, even featuring a guest verse from the rapper Logic celebrating Noob Noob, but it tells you Rick's real value system in a single gesture. He has infinite contempt for people who perform virtue and posture as heroes, and a quiet, genuine tenderness for the unglamorous people who just do the work and get sneered at for it. In a man who claims to care about nothing, that particular preference is not nothing. It is close to a moral code. Then there is Mr. Nimbus, who arrives at the very start of the 5th season in an episode called Mort Dinner Rick Andre, and he is one of the strangest recurring gags the show ever committed to. Mr. Nimbus is Rick's self-declared nemesis. He is the king of the ocean. He controls, in his own insistent words, the police. He is a preening, theatrical, absurd figure in a Poseidon costume, and he is voiced wonderfully by the co-creator Dan Harmon himself. And the joke of Mr. Nimbus is that Rick, the man who has stared down galactic empires and murdered his way across infinity, has this one ridiculous ocean-themed rival who truly rattles him, who he treats with wary, almost nervous respect. It is the series refusing to let Rick be perfectly invincible, insisting that even a god-tier genius has some petty, embarrassing, unresolved history with a man in a seashell codpiece. It humanizes Rick through sheer silliness, which is a trick this series is better at than almost any other. And then there is the arc I find the most quietly cruel of all of these, and it comes late in the 5th season, and it is about the crows. Rick, in a fit of frustration with Morty, decides that Morty is replaceable, that he does not actually need this specific anxious grandson, and he takes up instead with two crows going off on a stylized, anime-flavored adventure with a pair of birds as his new sidekicks, treating them as a full and adequate substitute for the boy. It is played as comedy, and it is funny, but underneath it is genuinely wounding because it dramatizes the exact thing Morty most fears about his own place in Rick's life, which is that he is interchangeable, that he could be swapped out for literally anything, even a couple of birds, and Rick would barely notice the difference. It is the infinite replaceability horror from the very top of this iceberg, brought all the way down to the personal level, aimed straight at the center of the one relationship the whole show is built on. Rick treating two crows as an acceptable Morty is, in miniature, the entire terrifying logic of the multiverse pointed like a knife at the person who loves him most. And you feel how much that would hurt, even as you laugh at the birds. We should talk about Jerry, because Jerry is easy to dismiss, and you are meant to dismiss him. And then, every so often, the writing gently asks whether dismissing him is fair. And that tension is one of the more interesting arguments running under the whole series. Jerry is Beth's husband, Morty and Summer's father, and he is, by the show's own relentless framing, a mediocrity. He is insecure, needy, easily frightened, prone to small vanities and smaller cowardices, and Rick despises him with a purity that is almost impressive. Rick's contempt for Jerry is bottomless. To Rick, Jerry represents everything he finds unbearable: ordinariness, dependence, emotional neediness, a man content to be small, and we are mostly invited to laugh along, to see Jerry as the series sees him, as a drag on everyone around him, the human anchor slowing down the adventure. But the series keeps complicating that, and the way it does it is often through the multiverse itself. Because if there are infinite Jerrys, then Jerry, the eternal loser, becomes a kind of natural resource, a universal constant of underachievement, and there is a lot of grim fun in that idea. There is an episode where, in order to keep Jerry safe and out of the way during dangerous business, there exists an entire daycare facility, a holding pen for Jerrys, a bland and padded room full of identical, anxious husbands being kept occupied and out of trouble like children. It is a brutal joke, the idea that Jerry is so uniformly incapable across all of reality that an institution exists solely to babysit him. And it is very funny, and it is also, if you let it land, bleak. It says the multiverse has looked at Jerry 1 billion times over and reached the same verdict every time. And yet, the verdict never quite gets to stand, because every now and then we see a Jerry who is loved, or a Jerry whose ordinary decency turns out to matter, or a moment where Beth remembers why she married him in the first place. Some flicker of gentleness and loyalty in him that Rick's genius simply does not contain. The deepest version of this argument is the marriage itself. Rick would very much like Beth to leave Jerry, has schemed to make it happen, and the writing keeps refusing to fully take Rick's side, keeps suggesting that Beth's bond with this unremarkable, frightened, kind man is not the failure of judgment Rick insists it is, that there might be something in a steady, ordinary love that all of Rick's cosmic brilliance cannot provide and secretly cannot stand. Jerry is the standing rebuke to Rick's whole value system. If the smartest, freest, most powerful being in the multiverse is also the loneliest and most broken, and the dim, timid, ordinary man is the one with a family that mostly still wants him around, then who exactly is the failure? That question never gets answered outright, but it keeps getting asked, and it keeps getting asked through Jerry. There is a darker thread here too, and it connects back to the abandoned dimensions we have been tracking all night, because the writing is careful to remind you that the cozy Smith family we follow is not the only Smith family, and the others paid for our family's adventures. When Rick abandons a reality, he leaves behind everyone in it, including the versions of Beth and Summer and Jerry who lived there, and some of those stranded families have been checked in on and found wrecked. There are versions of this household who lost their Rick and their Morty and simply fell apart, who suffered and died and curdled off-screen so that our version could keep having fun. The Great Portal Reset made some of that suffering literal and violent, dragging a bitter, abandoned Jerry back into the story only to destroy him. It is a way of keeping the ledger honest, of reminding you that behind every clean escape Rick makes, there is a room full of people, wearing the faces of the people we love, who did not get to escape, who got left in the wreckage as the price of the swap. We laugh at Jerry, and meanwhile some other Jerry, identical in every way, is being ground up somewhere off-screen so our story can stay light. That is the cost the multiverse hides, and Jerry, of all people, is where the series most often makes you pay attention to it. Now we leave the story entirely and go into the real-world layer of the iceberg, the production history, and this is where a lot of casual fans have no idea how strange the truth is, because the origin of this multi-million-dollar animation juggernaut is one of the most ridiculous origin stories in television. Rick and Morty did not begin as Rick and Morty. It began as a crude, filthy, deliberately offensive little cartoon short that Justin Roiland made back around 2006 for a small Los Angeles short film festival and creative collective called Channel 101. The short was called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, and it was essentially a vulgar parody of Back to the Future. Roiland took Doc Brown and Marty McFly, the mad scientist and the nervous teenager, and reduced them to a filthy joke. A lecherous old genius named Doc and a whimpering boy named Marty, running through a scenario built around an obscene punchline repeated over and over. It is gross. It is barely a story. And there is a widely repeated account that part of the reason Roiland made something quite so aggressively lawsuit baiting was almost as a dare, a shrug at the idea of intellectual property and cease and desist letters, having previously drawn legal attention with an earlier project. That filthy little parody is the primordial ooze the entire series crawled out of. The lecherous Doc became Rick Sanchez. The whimpering Marty became Morty Smith. And when Dan Harmon, the writer and creator behind the acclaimed sitcom Community, crossed paths with Roiland through the Channel 101 scene, the two of them saw something in that crude short worth developing. They took the two characters, kept the dynamic, the reckless genius and the overwhelmed boy, and made one enormous, brilliant change. They swapped the time travel for interdimensional travel. Instead of moving through history like the film they were parodying, Rick and Morty would move sideways through infinite parallel realities, and that single decision, trading time for the multiverse, is what turned a one-note dirty joke into a machine capable of generating the deepest and darkest science fiction on television. Everything we have spent this entire video exploring, the infinite Ricks, the replaceable Mortys, the central finite curve, all of it exists because two guys decided their Back to the Future parody should be about parallel worlds instead of time machines. The whole iceberg grew out of that one swap. Then there is the fact that for the first 6 seasons, one man was doing an astonishing amount of the work, because Justin Roiland did not just voice Rick. He voiced Morty too, both of them. The two lead characters, the grandfather and the grandson, the entire central relationship, were for years performed by the same person, often in the same recording session, talking to himself, arguing with himself, one man playing both halves of the show's soul. And on top of that, he voiced Mr. Poopy Butthole and many of the improvised interdimensional cable characters, and a whole rotating cast of aliens. The distinctive sound of early Rick and Morty, that loose, overlapping, half-improvised, deeply personal quality, comes in large part from the fact that the two people talking were frequently one person, riffing, sometimes with a drink in his hand, building the whole strange rhythm of it out of his own doubled voice. The ascent, once the show found its footing, was extraordinary. It won the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program twice. First in 2018 for Pickle Rick, that spectacle of a man rebuilding himself from rat parts, and again in 2020 for the Vat of Acid episode, the one about the murderous save points, which means both of the Emmy wins went, fittingly, to episodes that hid a devastating idea inside a piece of pure spectacle. And the business side got just as big. In 2018, Adult Swim made an almost unheard of commitment, ordering 70 additional episodes in a single long-term deal, an enormous vote of confidence that dwarfed everything that had come before, more episodes in one order than the first 3 seasons combined. That deal is why the series has kept rolling season after season, and it has since been extended even further, deep into future seasons that have not aired yet. A dirty Back to the Future parody made for a tiny short film night became one of the more secure, most awarded, most bankable properties in all of animation. Whatever else you want to say about it, that is an astonishing distance to travel, and it happened faster than almost anyone expected. And then, in January of 2023, the show faced the one crisis it could not write its way out of, and I want to walk through this carefully and neutrally, sticking only to what is documented, because it is a serious real-world matter and it deserves precision rather than gossip. In January 2023, it was reported that Justin Roiland, the co-creator and the voice of both Rick and Morty, had been charged back in 2020 with felony domestic violence involving a woman he had reportedly dated. The charges had been filed without publicity and only became public knowledge in early 2023. The reaction from the industry was swift and total. Adult Swim cut ties with Roiland and announced that Rick and Morty would continue without him. He was also removed from the other projects he was attached to, including the Hulu series Solar Opposites, which he had co-created, and he departed the video game studio he had founded, Squanch Games. In a matter of days, one of the more prolific figures in modern animation was severed from essentially everything he had built. Here's the part that requires care, because it is the part people most often get wrong or leave out. In March of 2023, only a couple of months after the charges became public, those charges were dismissed. The district attorney's office declined to proceed, citing insufficient evidence to prove the case. So the legal matter did not end in a conviction, it ended in a dismissal. But, and this is the crucial sequence, the studios had already made their decisions and announced his departure before that dismissal came down. The recasting was already underway, and the dismissal did not reverse it. Adult Swim did not bring him back. Whatever the legal outcome, the professional separation was permanent, and I'm going to state it plainly and leave it there, because it would be wrong to speculate beyond the documented facts about anyone's private life or the reasoning behind the studio's choices. He was charged, the charges were later dismissed for lack of evidence, and the show went on without him. Those are the facts. Which brings us to something unprecedented in television, the recast. Beginning with the 7th season, which aired in October of 2023, Rick and Morty were voiced by two new performers. Rick is now voiced by an actor named Ian Cardoni, and Morty by an actor named Harry Belden. And the production made a very deliberate choice about how to handle it. They did not reinvent the characters, they did not wink at the audience or address the change in the story. They cast performers who could reproduce the exact vocal texture of the original so faithfully that a huge portion of the audience, on first watch, could not clearly tell the difference. It was, on a technical level, a remarkable act of preservation. Two new actors stepping into a role that one man had improvised and inhabited for a decade, and matching it closely enough that the literal voice of both leads survived a transition that by all rights should have shattered it. Mr. Poopy Butthole and other characters were reassigned as well, and the machine kept running. Sit for a moment with how strange that actually is, because I think it is one of the stranger things about the current era of the show. Rick and Morty is a series whose entire theme is that individuals are replaceable, that you can swap out any specific person for a functionally identical version, and the story goes on more or less unchanged. And then, in the real world, its own co-creator and the voice of both its heroes was removed, and it replaced him with performers so precisely matched that the characters continued as if nothing had happened. The darkest philosophical premise came true in its own production. Rick told us for years that no single person is irreplaceable, that there is always another version who will do just as well, and then it proved that by replacing the irreplaceable man himself and barely dropping a frame. Whether you find that reassuring or chilling probably says a lot about how you feel about the whole series, and I honestly go back and forth on it. The 7th and 8th seasons are good. It is still recognizably itself, and it kept being itself without the voice that made it, which is either the ultimate vindication of its worldview or the loneliest possible proof of it. Now we go into the murkiest water of all, the fan theories. And I want to be scrupulous here because this is exactly the part of a video like this where a lazy channel starts narrating guesses as if they were facts. And I would rather be honest with you than sound authoritative. So everything in this stretch is theory. None of it is confirmed. I will tell you clearly where the show has spoken and where it has stayed silent. And where it has stayed silent, I am going to leave the silence intact. With that said, the theories are part of what makes this thing what it is. Because Rick and Morty was engineered to be theorized about, seeded with dangling threads specifically so that fans would spend the years between seasons arguing in the dark. The oldest and biggest of them we have already handled with care. The theory that evil Morty is Rick's original Morty, and I will only add that its endurance tells you something about how the fandom thinks. People want the multiverse to rhyme. They want the coldest villain to be secretly personal, secretly connected to our Rick by the deepest possible thread. It has never been confirmed and may never be, and part of me hopes it never is because the not knowing is doing more work than any answer could. Then there is a whole family of theories about what Rick really is, metaphysically, because the writing flirts constantly with the idea that Rick is not merely the smartest man in one universe, but something closer to a god or a devil within the story. He is billed in the show's own framing as the smartest being alive, and the deeper lore complicates even that, since the central finite curve means he is only guaranteed to be the cleverest inside a slice of reality that was rigged in his favor. So some fans read Rick as a kind of trapped god, a being with godlike power over his walled-off domain, who is nonetheless powerless against the one loss that defines him. Others go darker and read him as the story's actual devil, a tempter who drags an innocent boy through hell for his own amusement. And the writing has occasionally seemed to enjoy that reading, letting Rick do properly diabolical things and then dare you to keep rooting for him. These are interpretations, not facts, but they are interpretations the series actively courts, and the tension between God and devil, between the smartest man and the most damned one, is a big part of why the character never settles into something comfortable. There is a popular theory about the source of Rick's genius, the idea that his intelligence and his addiction are the same wound, that he drinks not despite being brilliant, but because being that brilliant, seeing that clearly, understanding exactly how small and doomed everything is unbearable without something to blunt it. This has never been laid out as a formal explanation, so I offer it strictly as a fan reading, but it is a reading the series seems sympathetic to, because it keeps tying Rick's intellect to his misery, keeps suggesting that the same capacity that lets him build a portal gun is the capacity that lets him see too clearly that nothing he builds will ever fill the hole. In that reading, the drinking is not a character flaw bolted onto a genius. It is the genius viewed from the other side. There is even a theory, and I want to flag this one especially clearly as unconfirmed speculation, that plays on the show's own logic to suggest Rick has effectively died and been replaced more times than we know, that the Rick we follow may not be continuous with the Rick we started with, that in a story about infinite interchangeable versions, we have no real guarantee the man on screen this week is the man from last week. Nothing like this has ever been confirmed as a specific event, and I am not telling you it happened, but it is the kind of vertigo the premise invites, and once it is in your head, it is hard to shake, which is precisely the point. And I do want to gently correct one thing that floats around in these conversations, because getting the facts right matters even about the fiction. There are all sorts of half-remembered claims about specific dark events in Rick's past that get passed around as canon when they were never actually depicted, and part of the fun and the discipline of loving this series is being willing to say, clearly, we do not know that. It was not shown to us. That is a story fans tell, not a thing that happened. The multiverse is a machine for generating confident nonsense, and the honest way to love it is to keep straight what is on the screen and what is in the comment section. We have spent so long on Rick that it is worth surfacing for a chapter to the grandson whose name is also on the marquee, because Morty's journey is the slow, sad secret of the whole thing, the one arc that changes the most while pretending to change the least. And to understand it, you have to understand what a Morty is in the deep logic of this universe, because the writing made the Mortys into an entire oppressed class. Back in that first season episode where Evil Morty is introduced, there is a small, haunting detail among the captive Mortys held at the Citadel. They have a religion. They pass around a prophecy about the one true Morty, a foretold Morty who will one day rise and free all the others from their bondage to the Ricks. It is played at first as a throwaway piece of world building, a funny little cult among the interchangeable grandsons. But it seeds one of the most important ideas in the series, which is that the Mortys are not just sidekicks. They are a people, a downtrodden, exploited, disposable people, bred and used and discarded across infinite realities, dreaming, like every oppressed people, of a liberator. And that reframes our Morty, the specific boy we follow, in a way that gets sadder the longer the run goes. Because when we meet him, he is the softest thing in the series. He is anxious, decent, easily overwhelmed, desperate for his grandfather's approval, horrified by violence, the moral center of a show that mostly refuses to have one. He is the audience's heart. And then the cruelest and most realistic thing possible happens to him. The adventures change him. Slowly, season over season, Morty gets harder. He sees too much. He digs too many graves, buries too many versions of himself, watches too many people die, absorbs too much of Rick's worldview by sheer proximity. The boy who used to be paralyzed by the sight of a corpse becomes a teenager who can handle a weapon without flinching, who can lie, who can leave someone behind, who occasionally sounds chillingly a little like his grandfather. There is never a big speech about it. You just notice, if you are paying attention, that the sweet kid from the first season is disappearing, worn down into something more capable and more damaged, and that Rick, who loves him, is the one doing the wearing. That is the tragedy the title hides. Rick and Morty sounds like a buddy comedy, 2 names, 1 adventure, and it is. But underneath it is the story of an old man slowly, unintentionally, out of loneliness and need, turning the last innocent person in his life into a smaller version of himself, and half hating himself for it, and being unable to stop because the alternative is being alone. Every time Rick drags Morty on another adventure, he is choosing his own need over the boy's innocence, and the boy pays for it in increments so small that no single episode looks like the crime. But stacked up over a decade, they amount to a childhood spent, a softness worn away. And Morty, for his part, keeps choosing to come along, keeps forgiving, keeps loving the impossible old man, because Rick is the most exciting and most terrible thing that will ever happen to him, and because somewhere in there, buried under all the cruelty, Rick does love him back, which may be the most damning thing of all. It would be easier if Rick did not love him, then it would just be exploitation. But Rick loves Morty and drags him into hell anyway and cannot figure out how to stop, and that is a far more human and far more painful failure than simple villainy. I think that is why the Two Crows arc I described earlier lands as hard as it does, and I will not retell it, but hold it up in this light. When Rick tries to replace Morty with 2 birds, he is not just being callous. He is testing whether he can get the companionship without the guilt, whether he can have a sidekick he is not slowly ruining, and of course he cannot, because the thing he actually needs is not a sidekick. It is that specific boy, and the whole horror of it is that needing that specific boy is exactly what is destroying him. The multiverse gave Rick infinite Mortys, and the one thing it could not give him was permission to stop endangering the one he chose. It helps, I think, to understand where the particular flavor comes from, because Rick and Morty did not appear out of nowhere fully formed, and the 2 men who made it each brought a very specific ingredient. We have talked about Roiland's contribution, the improvisation, the vulgarity, the loose anarchic energy, the doubled voice. The other half of the DNA belongs to Dan Harmon, and Harmon brought structure, which sounds like the least interesting thing a person could bring to a cartoon about a drunk scientist, and is actually the reason it can be as emotionally devastating as it is. Before Rick and Morty, Harmon created the sitcom Community, a beloved, restlessly experimental show about a community college study group, and across that and his other work. He became known for a particular tool, a storytelling framework he teaches and swears by, a circular model of how a satisfying story moves. A character starts in comfort, wants something, crosses a threshold into an unfamiliar world, struggles and adapts and pays a price, gets what they wanted or something like it, and returns changed. Round and round. It is an old idea, descended from the classic hero's journey, but Harmon systematized it into a repeatable engine, and he runs Rick and Morty episodes through it relentlessly. That is the secret to why something this cynical can hit so hard. The anarchy is Roiland. The architecture is Harmon. Underneath the improvised burps and the interdimensional cable and the gross-out gags, almost every episode is quietly built on a rigorous emotional skeleton, a real want, a real threshold, a real cost, a real return. So when it wants to break your heart, it has the structure already in place to do it. The machinery of a proper story sitting under what looks like chaos. The nihilism can be as loud as it likes on the surface, but the bones of every episode are shaped like a story that means something. And that contradiction, meaningful structure carrying a meaningless message, is the exact tension that makes the show feel the way it feels. It is a nihilist series built by a man who believes deeply in the shape of stories, and you can feel both things fighting in every episode. Harmon and Roiland's partnership also spun off into a wider little universe of adult animation, and the most notable sibling is Solar Opposites, which is worth a mention because fans sometimes get confused about how it relates to Rick and Morty. Solar Opposites premiered on Hulu in 2020, and it was co-created by Justin Roiland together with Mike McMahon, a writer who had worked on Rick and Morty. It is a science fiction comedy about a family of aliens stranded on Earth, and it shares a certain sensibility, the same fast, dense, sci-fi saturated comic voice, and for a while, Roiland voiced its lead alien, Corvo. But it is a separate show, made for a different platform, and it is not canonically connected to Rick and Morty, whatever crossover jokes fans might wish for. And when Roiland was dropped in 2023, Solar Opposites did the same thing Rick and Morty did. It recast. The actor Dan Stevens took over the role of Corvo, and that show too kept running without the co-creator whose voice had helped define it. 2 shows, 1 creative crisis, the same solution, the replaceable man replaced twice over. What all of this adds up to, for me, is a picture of something far more carefully made than its reputation as edgy stoner comedy suggests. People who have never watched it or who bounced off the loud, abrasive surface tend to imagine it as random, as a shock comedy machine cranking out gross gags for teenagers. And the surface can absolutely read that way. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that this is one of the most structurally disciplined, thematically consistent, emotionally serious things in modern animation. A series that has been telling one long story about grief and replaceability and the terror of being unimportant since its very first episode, dressed up in enough burps and aliens that a lot of people never noticed. The iceberg is not a gimmick here. There really is a vast, cold, coherent thing under the bright surface, and most of the audience only ever swims in the top few feet of it. I want to spend some time on the nihilism itself, because it is the thing the show is most famous for, and I think the thing it is most misunderstood about. And this is a distinction worth drawing carefully as we near the bottom. Rick and Morty got a reputation, especially in its early years, as the great nihilist cartoon, the one for people who had decided that nothing matters and wanted a genius to tell them they were right. Rick says it constantly, in 100 forms, nothing you do matters. There is no grand meaning. The universe is indifferent, morality is a fiction, love is chemistry, and the only rational response is to grab what pleasure you can and not take any of it seriously. And a certain kind of viewer took that as a creed, as the actual thesis, as permission. But I have come to think that reading is exactly backwards, that the writing is not endorsing Rick's nihilism at all. It is diagnosing it. Look at what actually happens to the man who believes nothing matters. He is not free, he is not happy. He is the most miserable person in the whole series. He drinks himself unconscious. He sabotages every relationship. He tried to kill himself in his garage. He spent decades on a revenge quest that left him hollow when it finally succeeded. If nihilism were the liberating truth Rick preaches, Rick would be at peace, and he is the furthest thing from it. You are not being shown a wise man who has seen through the illusion of meaning. You are being shown a wounded man who adopted the philosophy of meaninglessness as a painkiller after his family was taken from him, and who is now trapped inside that philosophy the way an addict is trapped, unable to feel the things that would make life worth living because he has spent so long insisting they are not real. Rick's nihilism is not the answer on offer. It is the disease being described. There is one episode that makes this almost literal, and it is worth pulling out here because it puts the whole idea under a microscope. It comes in the 3rd season in an episode called Rest and Reclaxation, and the premise is that Rick and Morty, worn out from an adventure, stop at an alien spa with a machine that promises to detox them to draw off their accumulated cognitive toxins and leave behind a cleaner, healthier version. It works. It splits each of them cleanly in 2. On one side, you get healthy Rick, calm, confident, unbothered, and on the other side, you get toxic Rick. Everything the machine decided was poison. And the reveal that turns the gag into a thesis is this: the toxins the machine pulled out of Rick were not just his cruelty and his arrogance. They were his attachment, his love, his grief over Diane, his need for Morty. The machine could not tell the difference between the parts of Rick that hurt him and the parts that let him feel anything at all, because in Rick they are the same substance, Healthy Rick, the version scrubbed of all of it, is not a better man. He is a serene, smiling sociopath, so unburdened by feeling that he is perfectly willing to kill his own toxic half and walk away. And it is the toxic half, the wounded, insecure, grieving one, that still loves his grandson and fights to survive and refuses to be thrown out. When Rick finally forces the two back together, he is choosing, in effect, to take his pain back, because the alternative, a Rick without pain, turned out to be a monster with a pleasant face. Morty, notably, flies off rather than re-merge with his own toxic self, and the episode lets that choice hang there unpunished. That is the whole argument about Rick's nihilism folded into a single science fiction gimmick. You cannot extract the damage without extracting the heart. The misery and the love grew from the same root, and a Rick who has truly stopped hurting is a Rick who has stopped caring, which is a far worse thing to be. It is not telling you that suffering is good. It is telling you that in a person this broken, the capacity to suffer and the capacity to love have fused so completely that you cannot amputate one without losing the other, and that Rick, on some level he would never say out loud, knows it and takes the pain back on purpose. And the proof is in the small countercurrent that runs under everything, because for all its cosmic bleakness, the story keeps betraying its own stated worldview. Every season, no matter how dark it gets, tends to return the family to the table, to each other, to some fragile, unearned, unjustifiable bond that the philosophy says should not matter, and clearly does. Rick keeps choosing Morty. He keeps coming home to Beth. He keeps, despite everything, showing up. His actions constantly contradict his words, and in something this carefully built, that contradiction is not an accident. It is the argument. The words say nothing matters. The behavior says this person matters to me so much that I have organized my entire impossible life around being near them, and I would rather die than admit that out loud. That gap between what Rick says and what Rick does is where the real show lives. Even that famous line, the thesis line I quoted from way up near the surface, the one about nobody existing on purpose and everybody dying and going to watch television, even that turns out to be gentler than it sounds when you really hear it in context. It is not spoken as a counsel of despair. It is spoken as a comfort from one frightened kid to another, standing over a grave. What Morty is actually saying to his suicidal sister is, not give up, life is pointless. What he is saying is, none of us chose to be here, none of us knows what any of it means, we are all equally lost. And so you do not have to carry the weight of making your life justify itself. You are allowed to just be here with me and watch some television, and that is enough. It is nihilism, technically, but it is nihilism deployed as mercy, as a way of setting down an unbearable burden. If nothing has to mean anything, then you are free to stop torturing yourself for failing to be meaningful. The warmth sneaks in through the back door of the bleakness, and I think anyone who watched this as pure cynicism missed the entire thing. So no, I do not think Rick and Morty is a nihilist show. Not really. I think it is a show about a nihilist, made by people who understand that nihilism is usually grief wearing a clever disguise, and that the way out of it is not a better argument but a warmer room. It keeps putting its broken genius in front of the one thing his philosophy cannot explain, which is that he loves these ordinary people and cannot stop, and it keeps letting that unexplainable love win quietly in the last few minutes, over and over, without ever quite admitting that is what happened. That is not despair. That is something closer to stubborn, hidden hope, the kind you only trust because it refuses to announce itself. There is a whole layer of the iceberg that has nothing to do with the fiction and everything to do with what happened around it. The strange and sometimes ugly story of how the show was received, and it is worth going into because it is one of the more revealing things about this series and about us. Rick and Morty did not just get popular, it got claimed. It became, for a stretch in the late 2010s, a kind of identity, a flag people flew, and a certain slice of the fandom developed a reputation, fairly or not, for a specific obnoxious pride. The idea that you had to have a very high intelligence to really appreciate it, that Rick was not a cautionary figure but an aspirational one, a genius who had transcended the sentimental illusions the rest of us cling to. People wanted to be Rick. They quoted his cruelty as if it were wisdom. They treated his contempt for other people as a personality upgrade. And the writers noticed. This is the part I find genuinely fascinating because you can watch the series start to argue with its own audience in real time. The therapist scene we talked about near the top, the one where a calm professional looks at Rick and tells him he is not a superior being, he is just a man who refuses to do the work of being a person, that scene reads differently once you know it aired to a fan base busy idolizing exactly the trait she is puncturing. The show was, in effect, turning to the part of its audience that wanted to be Rick and saying, gently and then less gently, you have misunderstood him. He is not winning, he is drowning, and if you want to be like him, you have not been paying attention. Over the later seasons, the writers leaned into that, making Rick's flaws harder to romanticize, letting him be pathetic as well as brilliant, refusing to let his nihilism be cool. It is a rare thing, a hit show actively trying to disillusion the fans who love it for the wrong reasons. The Szechuan sauce affair, which we walked through way up at the surface, belongs to this layer too in retrospect, because it was the moment the gap between what the show was saying and what some of its fans heard became a physical event in the world. The writers wrote a joke mocking the emptiness of obsessive desire, and a piece of the audience responded by descending on fast food restaurants in a frenzy of obsessive desire, missing the joke so completely that they became it. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that, a satire of mindless want producing, in the real world, a small riot of mindless want. It held up a mirror, and a portion of the crowd tried to climb through it. And I do not say that with contempt exactly, because it is such a human thing. To love a story so much that you accidentally embody the exact flaw it was warning you about. What all of this adds up to is a series with a complicated relationship to its own success, and I think that complication is part of why it has lasted and why it keeps mattering. Most hit shows want to be loved uncritically. Rick and Morty seems almost uncomfortable with the kind of love it received, forever poking at its fans, forever undercutting the thing they came for, forever insisting that its brilliant nihilist hero is a warning and not a role model. It got famous for the wrong reasons and then spent years stubbornly trying to correct the record from inside its own episodes. Whether it succeeded is an open question. There are still plenty of people out there who think Rick is right, who think the lesson is that caring is for the weak, but the writing did its part. It kept telling them in every register it had that the cleverest man in the room is also the saddest, and that his intelligence bought him nothing but a clearer view of everything he had lost. If you walk away from Rick and Morty wanting to be Rick, you did not watch the same show I did. Which leaves us with an unusual question for a show still on the air, one I do not think any other long-running series has faced in quite this form. What is Rick and Morty about now that its central engine has been switched off? Think about what the deep lore actually accomplished. For most of the series' existence, the invisible motor under everything was Rick's revenge. The hunt for Rick Prime, the search for the man who murdered Diane. It was the reason the portal gun existed, the reason Rick was the way he was, the buried why of the whole character. And in the 7th season, the brave, dangerous thing happened. Rick was allowed to finish. Rick Prime died, the revenge was completed, and in doing so, the writers deliberately removed the one thing that had been driving the protagonist since before the show even began. Most series would never do that. Most series keep the great villain alive and dangling for as long as possible, because the chase is the show. Rick and Morty ended the chase on purpose, and now it has to answer the hardest question there is, the one Rick himself has been running from all along. When the thing you organized your whole life around is finished, and you are still alive and still in pain, what do you do with the days that are left? That is not a plot problem. That is the actual subject of the later seasons, and it is a braver subject than most shows would ever choose. A man defined by a wound gets the closest thing to closure the universe can offer, and discovers that closure does not heal him, that the revenge he thought would complete him just leaves a differently shaped emptiness, and now he has to figure out how to be a person without the hatred that used to hold him together. The question hanging over these episodes is whether Rick can build a life out of the small, unglamorous, genuine things, the granddaughter, the grandson, the daughter, the ordinary Tuesday, now that the grand quest is over, and there is no pretending that is easy and no guarantee he can. That is a remarkably mature place for a cartoon that started as a filthy Back to the Future parody to end up an old man learning or failing to learn how to live after the one thing that gave his suffering a purpose has been taken away by his own hand. And the future stays open in exactly the ways the writers want it to, because they left the two biggest wild cards deliberately unresolved. Evil Morty is still out there, alive and free, on the far side of the wall, in the true infinite multiverse, holding the most dangerous weapon in the story, the device that can erase anything from every reality at once. That door has not been closed. The most fascinating antagonist got walked out into infinity and left there, a loaded gun on the mantelpiece of the entire cosmos, ready to be picked back up whenever the writers choose. That is the story keeping its options open at the largest possible scale. Rick Prime is finished, the revenge is spent, but the being who made that revenge possible is loose in creation with the power to unmake anyone and nobody. Not Rick, not us, knows what he intends to do with it. Meanwhile, in the real world, the show is secured far into a future it has not yet written, renewed well beyond the seasons currently airing, a commitment that means Rick and Morty will very likely still be arriving years from now, long past the point where most shows have burned out. It has already outlived the involvement of one of the two men who created it. It has already survived the loss of the voice that defined both of its leads. It has already completed the revenge that was supposed to be its ending and kept going anyway. This is a series that has repeatedly done the thing that should kill a show and then simply refuse to die. And there is something very Rick about that. A stubborn refusal to stop existing even after the reason to keep going has evaporated. Whether that is admirable or a little sad is, once again, exactly the kind of question it would want you turning over in the dark, and it is exactly the kind it has never once answered cleanly. There is one more deep current I want to trace before we surface for good, and it is the relationship with death, because Rick and Morty handles mortality in a way no other cartoon really does, and the way it does it is the source of a lot of its quiet dread. In most animated shows, death is either permanent and serious, treated with weight, or it is cartoon death, comedy death, the character back next week with no consequences. This series invented a third thing, and that third thing is far more unsettling than either. Here, death is constant, casual, and cheap, and yet it refuses to let death be meaningless, and holding those two facts together is what gives the show its particular chill. Consider how much death it contains. Rick kills routinely, offhandedly, in enormous numbers, whole rooms, whole species, whole planets, and the tone barely shifts. Characters we know die and are replaced with variants, and everyone shrugs. Our own heroes, remember, are living in a dead family's house, having buried their own corpses. Death here is not a dramatic event, it is weather. It happens all the time, to everyone, including the leads, and the multiverse makes it reversible in the cheapest possible way, because there is always another version, always a replacement, always a fresh reality to flee into when this one breaks. That is the mercy and the horror of the premise braided together. Nobody has to stay dead, which sounds like a relief until you realize it means nobody's death gets to matter, that grief itself becomes almost impossible when the lost person can be swapped for an identical one, that the very thing that makes death survivable in this universe is the thing that makes it meaningless. And then, against all of that casual, cheap, reversible death, the story places the deaths that are absolute, and it is the contrast that makes them land like a hammer. Diane is the great example, the one I keep returning to because the whole series returns to her. In a universe where nothing stays gone, where every loss has a workaround, where you can always portal to a world where the dead are alive, Diane is the exception built with surgical cruelty. She is not just dead, she is erased from every reality, beyond any variant, beyond any workaround, permanently and totally, by a weapon designed for exactly that purpose. In a cosmos of cheap, reversible death, she is the one death that is real, and that is precisely why it is the wound the entire show orbits. The multiverse offers infinite second chances at everything except the one thing Rick actually wants, and it was engineered that way on purpose so that the man who can cheat every death would have to live forever with the single death he cannot. That, I think, is the deepest and most adult idea about mortality here, and it is almost the opposite of what the reputation suggests. The horror of Rick and Morty is not that death is final. The horror is that death is usually not final, that in a big enough universe, nothing is ever quite lost, and that this turns out to be worse, not better, because it drains meaning out of everything. A life only matters if it can be truly lost, and a universe of infinite copies is a universe where nothing can be truly lost and therefore nothing quite matters. And Rick, who built his life on exploiting exactly that, is the man most poisoned by it. He can bring anyone back, replace anyone, flee any consequence, and it has made him hollow. The one time the universe told him no, the one loss it made permanent, is the only thing in his entire endless existence that ever fully meant something, because it was the only thing he could not undo. The real argument about death, buried under all the casual carnage, is that finality is not the enemy of meaning. Finality is the price of it. And Rick, who spent his genius escaping every finality, ended up with a life that means almost nothing to him except for the single loss he was never allowed to escape. We have circled Rick's grandson and Rick's dead wife, but there is a relationship sitting right between them that is arguably the true emotional axis of the whole show. And that is Rick and his daughter Beth. Everything about how the series begins depends on a fact it takes years to fully explain. When it starts, Rick has, after decades away, shown up on Beth's doorstep and moved into her garage, inserting himself back into the life of the daughter he abandoned when she was a child. And the deep lore gives that homecoming a devastating weight, because the Beth he came home to is not the daughter he lost. His original daughter, the little girl who died with Diane, is gone forever. This Beth, the adult surgeon whose garage he lives in, belongs to a different reality, one where a version of her survived to grow up. Rick, in a sense, came back to be a father to a daughter who is and is not the one he failed. He is trying to make up a debt to a dead child by paying it to a living stranger who wears her face. That is the engine under Beth and Rick, and it explains so much of how they move around each other. Beth adores her father. She has spent her whole life idolizing him, aching for his approval, defining herself by the fact that she is the smart one, Rick Sanchez's daughter, the one who takes after the genius. And Rick cannot bear it, not because he does not love her, but because he loves her too much and knows he does not deserve the worship, knows that the man she idolizes is the man who left her, who chose his revenge over her childhood, who is the reason she grew up with a hole where a father should have been. Every time Beth looks at Rick with those hopeful, needy eyes, she is asking him to be the father he never was. And every time he deflects it with a joke or a drink or a portal, because the alternative is to stand still and feel the full weight of what he did to her and to her mother and to the little girl who did not get to grow up. His flippancy toward Beth is not indifference. It is a man flinching away from the one person whose love he cannot metabolize, because it comes attached to a guilt he cannot survive looking at directly. And the clone, the choice we walked through earlier, lands even harder in this light, because look at what it really was. Faced with a daughter whose unhappiness he had helped cause, whose life he had warped from the very beginning by being both absent and, when present, terrifying, Rick's response was to offer to duplicate her rather than to actually father her through a hard choice. He would build her a copy, split her in two, do anything, spend any amount of genius, rather than sit in a room and have an honest conversation about why she is so unhappy and what part he played in it. It is the same avoidance as the Pickle, the same avoidance the therapist named, aimed this time at his own child. He can give Beth a spaceship, a clone, a whole galaxy of adventure. The one thing he cannot give her is the simple, sober, present father she actually needed, because to be that would mean facing what his absence cost. And Rick has spent his entire life engineering elaborate escapes from exactly that kind of reckoning. I find Beth the most quietly tragic figure in the show for that reason, more than Rick even. Rick at least understands his own damage. Beth mostly does not. She carries a wound her father gave her and mistakes it for a bond, keeps reaching toward the very source of her pain for the healing it can never provide, keeps organizing her identity around a man who is constitutionally incapable of giving her what she is asking for. And the writing is honest enough never to fully resolve it, never to give them the clean reconciliation scene where he apologizes and she forgives and the wound closes. Real damage does not close that way, And whatever else this show does, it tells the truth about damage. Rick and Beth love each other across a gap that neither of them knows how to cross, and they will probably keep loving each other across it for as long as the series runs, which is one of the more recognizable and human things in the entire cosmic sprawl. The one member of this family we have barely mentioned is, I think, secretly the most important, because she is the closest thing the show has to a person who is going to be okay, and that person is Summer. When the series begins, Summer is easy to overlook. Written at first as a fairly standard older teenage sister, phone in hand, obsessed with her social standing, her boyfriend, her image, seemingly the family member least suited to interdimensional adventure. Morty is the chosen sidekick. Summer is the one left at home. And for a while, that is the joke, that Summer desperately wants to be included in Rick's world and keeps getting sidelined, treated as less interesting than her nervous younger brother. But the longer the run goes, the more it becomes clear the writers had something different in mind for her. And her arc is one of the most satisfying quiet developments in the whole thing, because Summer, it turns out, can handle it. Where Morty is broken down by the adventures, hardened against his will, worn thin, Summer meets the chaos and, disturbingly, thrives in it. She adapts. She gets tougher in a way that looks less like damage and more like competence. She learns to fight, learns to scheme, learns to stand up to Rick, and she does it without losing herself the way Morty slowly does. There is a real argument to be made that Summer is the most well-adjusted member of the entire family, the one who absorbs the horror of an infinite, indifferent universe, and rather than being crushed by it like Rick, or hollowed by it like Morty, or overwhelmed by it like Jerry, simply integrates it and keeps going. She looks the meaninglessness in the eye and does not flinch and does not break. And she still, crucially, cares about her family, still shows up, still holds on to the bonds the philosophy says do not matter. If Rick is the cautionary tale of what too much clarity does to a person, Summer might be the quiet suggestion that clarity does not have to destroy you, that you can know the universe is indifferent and choose to love people anyway and be fine. And that points at the thing the whole show keeps circling back to, the answer it never quite states but keeps demonstrating, which is the family itself. Strip away the portal guns and the councils and the cosmic weapons, and Rick and Morty is, structurally, a family sitcom. It is a story about a household, a garage, a dinner table, a set of people bound together by blood and habit and grievance who keep, despite everything, coming back to the same house. And no matter how far it travels, how deep into the multiverse it goes, how bleak its philosophy gets, it always returns to that table. The season ends and the family is together. The crisis passes and they are eating dinner. The universe is proven meaningless, and then Rick, who proved it, comes home for supper. The cosmology says nothing matters and no one is irreplaceable. And the structure, the thing it actually does week after week, says these specific people keep choosing each other across infinity. And that choosing is the only argument against the void the series is willing to fully make. That is why I do not think this is a cold show, even though it is about the coldest possible universe. A cold show would leave its characters scattered across the meaninglessness. Rick and Morty keeps gathering them back up. It keeps insisting, through its bones if not its dialogue, that in an infinite and indifferent cosmos, the one thing that can still hold weight is the stubborn, irrational, unjustifiable decision to belong to a particular handful of people, and to keep returning to them even when you have personally proven that they are replaceable, even when you know better, even when you are the cleverest being alive, and you understand exactly how pointless it is, and you come home anyway. The family is the answer the show is too cynical to say out loud and too honest to ever abandon. Before we surface, let us drift through some of the smaller oddities, the little canonical details and loose facts fans trade back and forth, because a story this dense hides a lot in its corners, and some of these are the kind of thing you only notice on a second or third watch. Take Rick's age, which is a surprisingly slippery number. He is generally treated as being around 70, an old man, a grandfather, and that is the figure most people go with. But the writing has not always been perfectly consistent about it. There is at least one throwaway line in the second season That puts his age at 80, and if you go digging through the more obscure corners of the show's own materials, you can find other numbers that do not quite line up. It is not a deep mystery, it is mostly just the loose way a fast comedy tracks its own details. But it is a small reminder that even the basic facts about the lead have a little wobble in them, that Rick is old and precise beyond the number, and the number itself was never the point. Then there is the phrase that gets hung on him constantly, the billing that follows Rick everywhere, that he is the smartest man in the universe. And once you understand the deep lore, that title curdles into something almost sad, because we know the secret behind it. Rick is only guaranteed to top the intelligence charts because of the wall his kind built, the machine that carved off the exact slice of infinity where that would always be true. The title is real inside the fence and meaningless outside it, so every time the billing gets repeated, it is, if you know, quietly telling on him, reminding you that his supremacy is not a fact of nature but a gerrymander, a rigged game, a comforting lie the Ricks built to protect themselves from the unbearable size of real infinity. It sounds like a boast. Underneath, it is the saddest thing about him. The series is also famously packed with background detail, the kind of thing that rewards pausing, that hides small jokes and small horrors in the corners of frames, that builds a culture of fans going through episodes frame by frame looking for the things they missed at speed. A lot of the improvised material we talked about, the interdimensional cable especially, was designed to be too fast and too dense to fully catch on a first pass, so that it keeps giving you more the closer you look. That is part of why it sustains an entire ecosystem of theory videos and deep dives like this one, because it was built deliberately to have more under the surface than any single watch can reach, which is a fitting design for a show whose whole subject is that there is always another layer, another version, another world just underneath the one you can see. And there are the little running jokes that hide real ideas, like the way it handles its own celebrity guests and its own throwaway aliens, giving them absurd names and absurder fates, a rapper turning up to sing about a janitor, a musician revealed to be an exiled alien whose true form has a watery pun for a name, a self-serious ocean king who controls the police. These things get scattered everywhere, and most of them are just jokes, and a few of them turn out to matter later, and the fun of being a fan is never quite knowing in the moment which is which. That is the texture of Rick and Morty at the level most people never slow down for, a surface so busy and so fast that it functions as its own kind of camouflage, hiding the enormous cold structure underneath behind a shimmer of gags moving too quickly to fully register. It is an iceberg even in its individual frames, and that, more than any single piece of lore, might be the truest thing about it. I have been describing a lot of devastation tonight, and if you had never seen it, you might be wondering how on earth all of this is also, supposedly, one of the funniest cartoons ever made. And the answer to that is the single most important thing to understand about how Rick and Morty actually works. The comedy is not a break from the sadness. The comedy is the delivery system for the sadness. This is a show that discovered very early that if you make people laugh hard enough, you can slip something unbearable past their defenses in the same breath that a joke lowers your guard at the exact moment it wants to reach in and break your heart. And it has used that mechanism so consistently and so precisely that it has become the fundamental technique. Think about how many of the moments we have gone through tonight arrived wrapped in comedy. A man turns himself into a pickle, which is hilarious, and the joke is the vehicle for a therapist's diagnosis of a suicidal avoidance so total it would rather become a vegetable than feel a feeling. A cheerful party song performed by a fun teenage version of Grandpa, which is a delight, and the song is a trapped man screaming that he is dying in a vat, a silly cry of a catchphrase printed on t-shirts, which turns out to mean, "Please help me, I am in unbearable pain." A friendly blue creature that grants wishes, which is a great gag, and the gag is a meditation on beings who find existence itself agonizing. Over and over, the funniest premise in the episode is the same object as the saddest idea in the episode. The laugh and the wound are not next to each other. They are the same thing, seen from two angles, and it cuts between them so fast that you feel both at once, the joy and the horror arriving in a single sensation that does not really have a name. That is a rare thing to be able to do, and it is why it gets under people's skin in a way a straightforwardly dark drama never could. If Rick and Morty simply told you, soberly, that its hero was a suicidal alcoholic destroyed by grief, you would keep it at arm's length, file it under sad, and move on. But it does not let you keep it at arm's length because it makes you laugh first, opens you up, gets past the part of you that guards against being moved, and then, while you are still laughing, it shows you the thing underneath, and by then, it is too late. You're already inside it. You already feel it. The comedy is a key that opens a door your defenses would normally hold shut. That is why people who love this show tend to love it with an intensity that surprises them. Why a cartoon about a burping scientist ends up being the thing that made them cry, because it reached a place only laughter could open. And it means the show is doing something almost sneaky with its own reputation, letting itself be marketed and merchandised and memed as a wild, irreverent, good time comedy, wearing that as camouflage while being one of the most sustained meditations on grief and loneliness, and the search for meaning that television has produced. The people who came for the burps got the burps. They also, whether they wanted it or not, got the other thing, absorbed it through the burps, carried it home without quite noticing. That is the con at the center of Rick and Morty, and it is a benevolent con, the best kind, the kind that gives you something real while you think you are just being entertained. It makes you laugh so that it can tell you the truth, and the truth is that being alive in an indifferent universe is lonely and frightening, and mostly bearable only because of the people who agree to be lonely and frightened alongside you. It just never says that part with a straight face because it knows you would not let it. It is worth pausing as we start to rise back toward the surface on how much this one show changed the water around it. Because Rick and Morty did not just succeed, it shifted what adult animation was allowed to be, and you can feel its fingerprints all over the decade that followed. When it arrived, the landscape of grown-up cartoons was dominated by a certain shape, the long-running domestic sitcom in animated form, the family around the couch, the joke-a-minute suburban comedy that could run for decades without its characters aging or its world deepening. Rick and Morty came in and demonstrated that an adult cartoon could be something else entirely, could be densely serialized, could build a mythology as intricate as any live-action science fiction saga, could be emotionally devastating and philosophically ambitious while still being crude and fast and funny. It proved there was a huge, hungry audience for animation that refused to choose between stupid and profound, that insisted on being both at once. And the wave that came after it is real. A whole generation of adult animated science fiction and comedy that leans into serialization, into darkness, into big ideas wrapped in irreverence, exists in a world Rick and Morty helped make possible, that took the permission it established and ran with it. Its own creators spun off adjacent series. Its success helped make the case to networks and streamers that this kind of story was worth investing in at scale, which is part of what that enormous long-term episode order back in 2018 really represented. A bet not just on one show, but on the idea that this whole mode of storytelling had a durable future. It became a load-bearing pillar of its network's identity and a genuine cultural force, the rare cartoon that people who do not watch cartoons still know, whose catchphrases and images escaped into the general language, whose characters became shorthand. There is a cost to that ubiquity, of course, the flattening that happens to anything that gets big enough. The way a story about the emptiness of desire becomes a line of collectible merchandise, the way a cry of pain becomes a t-shirt, the way a careful meditation on grief gets reduced, in the wider culture, to a pickle and a sauce and a meme about intelligence. It has lived that contradiction its whole life, being simultaneously one of the most thoughtful things on television and one of its most merchandised, being both the wound and the wound printed on a coffee mug. And it has, to its credit, mostly refused to resolve that contradiction in its own favor, refused to get precious about itself, kept undercutting its own profundity with a fart joke at the exact moment you were about to take it too seriously, which is honestly the only way something this bleak could have stayed bearable for as long as it has. What it will be remembered for, I think in the long run, once the merchandising fades and the memes age out and the cultural noise dies down, is that it took the oldest and hardest questions, the ones about whether anything means anything, whether love is real or just chemistry, whether a life can matter in a universe indifferent to it, and it asked them honestly, without flinching, without cheating toward an easy answer, in the unlikeliest possible form, a gross-out cartoon about a scientist and his grandson. That is a strange and remarkable achievement, and the strangeness is the achievement. Nobody would have designed it this way on purpose. It grew, half by accident, out of a filthy joke, into one of the few serious things its medium has ever produced, and it did it while never once stopping being funny. Things like that do not come along often, and when they do, they tend to be arguing with something much larger than television. There is one more piece of the deep architecture I do not want to leave out, because it is the arc that ties the personal Rick to the political Rick, and that is the Galactic Federation, the great bureaucratic empire that looms over the first few seasons and gives the show its clearest villain that is not a version of Rick himself. We have already touched the wound at its center, the wedding, where Birdperson's bride was revealed as a Federation agent and the celebration became a trap. That betrayal was not just personal, it was the Federation reaching into Rick's life and weaponizing his one real friendship against him. And it ended with Rick eventually turning himself in to Federation custody to spare his family, one of the few times we ever see him choose sacrifice over escape. And then comes the payback, in that surprise April Fool's third season premiere, and it is one of the more satisfying displays of Rick's power in the whole series, precisely because it is not really about fighting. The Federation has, by this point, taken over Earth. They have annexed the whole planet, folded humanity into their vast blue-skin bureaucracy, given everyone jobs and assessments and a suffocating administrative peace. Jerry, tellingly, thrives in it because Jerry is exactly the kind of small, compliant man an empire is built to reward. Rick, imprisoned and being mind-probed, appears cornered and then reveals that being cornered was the plan. He body hops through the Federation's own security using a mind virus, works his way to the levers of their society, and instead of shooting his way out, he attacks the thing an empire actually runs on. He collapses their economy. He reaches into the machinery of the Federation and renders their currency worthless in an instant, and the entire empire, this galaxy-spanning authoritarian order, simply falls apart, because it turns out a bureaucracy is only as strong as the numbers it agrees to believe in. And Rick stopped believing in them and took the belief away from everyone else too. The Federation does not lose a war. It loses its faith in its own money and dissolves. And in the same stroke, in that same premiere, Rick does not stop at the Federation. He turns the chaos on the other great structure that has been hunting him, the Council of Ricks, the governing body of the Citadel, and their leadership is destroyed in the upheaval too. It is worth noticing how much that single episode clears off the board. In roughly 40 minutes, it topples the Galactic Federation and decapitates the ruling Council of the Ricks, wiping out both of the great authorities that had shaped the first two seasons, and it does it almost casually as a demonstration of what Rick is capable of when he decides to stop being contained. But every structure that falls leaves a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. The collapse of the Council of Ricks is precisely the opening that lets the Citadel be rebuilt into the strange democracy we visit later, the one an ambitious eye-patched Morty climbs to the top of. Rick tears down an order and, without meaning to, clears the ground for the one being clever enough to build a new order and then escape it. He is always sowing the seeds of the thing that will get away from him, because a man who destroys every structure he touches cannot help but destroy the structures that were containing his enemies too. It is the whole shape of his life in one episode, a burst of brilliant, gleeful destruction that solves the immediate problem and plants the next catastrophe. And he never once slows down long enough to notice the pattern, because slowing down is the one thing he cannot afford to do. I love that as a piece of writing because it tells you exactly what Rick's real enemy is, and it is not any single villain. It is systems. It is the whole idea of an organized order that tells people who they are and what they are worth and how to behave. The Federation, the Council of Ricks, the Citadel, even the central finite curve itself, these are all the same target from different angles, structures that exist to rank and contain and administer beings. And Rick's deepest instinct, deeper than his grief even, is to walk into any such structure and take it apart, to prove that the order was never real, that the authority was a story everyone agreed to, that the whole thing can be dissolved by one person who refuses to play along. He does it to the Federation with their currency, he does it to the Council of Ricks by refusing to join and then outsmarting them. And the tragedy is that the one structure he built rather than destroyed, the Citadel, the wall around reality, is the one that eventually produces the being who escapes it and leaves him behind. There is a real politics in that, and the writing is smart enough not to make it comfortable. Rick is an anarchist in the truest sense, a man constitutionally incapable of accepting any authority above himself, and the show both admires that and shows you its cost. Because a man who can dissolve any system, who trusts no order and submits to no structure, is also a man who cannot build anything lasting, cannot belong to anything, cannot rest inside any arrangement long enough for it to hold him. His freedom from every system is the same thing as his homelessness within all of them. He tears down the Federation and liberates the Earth, and it does not make him happy, because the thing wrong with Rick was never that he was oppressed by a system. The thing wrong with Rick is that he is alone, and no revolution against any empire can fix that, because the empire was never the real cage. The real cage is the grief, and there is no economy he can collapse to get out of it. So let us look back up the way we came, at the whole shape of the descent, because I think the iceberg of Rick and Morty has a shape, and it is not random, and seeing it whole is the last thing I want to give you before we let this all go quiet. At the top, in the bright water, it tells you that nothing matters, and it tells you cheerfully, with a burp and a catchphrase and a portal gun, and you laugh, and it feels like freedom, like a great cosmic joke everyone is finally in on. That is the surface. That is where most people live in this show, and it is a fun place to live. And then, if you go down, the joke starts to change temperature. The catchphrase turns out to mean, please help me. The dimension hopping turns out to mean a boy burying his own body. The genius turns out to mean a widower who cannot stop running. The infinite replaceability that felt like freedom at the top turns out, at the bottom, to be the very thing that has hollowed the hero out. Because if everyone is replaceable, then no loss should hurt. And the whole tragedy of Rick is that one loss hurts more than infinity can hold. That is the movement of the entire show, top to bottom, and it is the movement we just made together tonight. It starts as a comedy about how nothing matters, and it ends, way down in the cold and the dark, as a story about the one thing that mattered so completely that erasing it required a weapon capable of reaching across every reality at once. 10 years spent descending from nothing matters to this mattered more than everything, and it never announces the turn, never rings a bell to tell you the joke has become a wound. It just keeps going down, one layer at a time, trusting you to follow. And the deepest point of the whole thing, the true bottom of the iceberg, is not a battle or a villain or a piece of lore. It is a ruined house in a dead world playing a recording of a voice to a room with no one in it. An old man standing in the wreckage of his first life, listening to his erased wife say hello. Everything above that, every alien and council and clone and cosmic weapon, is the enormous machinery required to earn that one quiet, unbearable image. And what it leaves you with, once you have been all the way down and come back up, is not despair, which is the thing people expect from a show with this reputation. It is something stranger and better. It is the sense that the smartest, freest, most powerful being imaginable, a man who can go anywhere and do anything and escape any consequence, would trade all of it, the whole infinite multiverse, for one ordinary morning with the people he lost and cannot, and so comes home instead to the people he has left and sits down at the table and stays. It never tells you that is the meaning of life. It is far too cool for that. But it shows it to you, again and again, in the space between what Rick says and what Rick does, and if you watched closely enough to see it, then you understand it better than the version that lives on the t-shirts. The nothing matters was never the point. The coming home anyway was always the point. It just made you laugh so hard on the way down that you did not notice it teaching you the only thing it actually believes. If you have made it this far, all the way to the bottom of the iceberg and back, then thank you, genuinely, for spending this long night with me. And I hope somewhere in the descent, your eyes got heavy and the room got soft and the words started to blur, because that is exactly what this was for. Rick and Morty is going to keep going out there in the dark for years yet, new seasons arriving long after most shows would have stopped, its great villain still loose somewhere past the wall of the world, its old man still trying and mostly failing to learn how to live now that his revenge is spent. There will be more lore, more mysteries, more layers added to the bottom of the ice, and maybe we will come back down here together someday and map the new depths. But for tonight, this is where we rest. A cartoon that started as a filthy joke became one of the saddest and truest things on television, an argument dressed up as an adventure, a cry for help disguised as a catchphrase, a story that used every trick it had to convince a tired, distractible audience to care about the oldest questions there are. That it managed to do all of that while making us laugh is, When you really consider it, a small miracle, and small miracles are worth staying up late for. So let your eyes close now, and let the multiverse spin on without you for a while, because it will, whether you watch it or not, and there is a strange comfort in that too. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.